Well, good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to the second day of our World War II weekend here at the Eisenhower National Historic Site. It is my great pleasure to introduce our first guest speaker of the day. From destroyers and demolition teams to beachmasters and breakwaters, the U.S. Navy was an essential component of Allied victory on D-Day. More than simply ferrying the largest amphibious assault force in history across the English Channel, the U.S. Navy played a critical role in clearing the beaches, blasting German resistance, and keeping Allied troops on the front line supplied with everything they needed to liberate France and defeat the German army. This presentation will explore the heroic and often overlooked role of America's seaborne service in the most important operation of the war. Tyler Bamford, Ph.D., is a historian with the Naval History and Heritage Command in Washington, D.C. He previously served as the inaugural Sherry and Alan Leventhal Research Fellow at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. He is the author of numerous articles that have been featured in journals such as Army History and the Journal of Military History. His first book, Forging the Anglo-American Alliance, the British and American Armies 1917 to 1941, was published in 2022 by the University Press of Kansas. Dr. Bamford is also the editor of the forthcoming volume, Best Beloved, The Wartime Letters of Fleet Admiral Chester W. Nimitz to his wife, Catherine, which will be published in the fall of 2024. It is my great pleasure to hand over our podium to Dr. Bamford.
Thank you so much, Alice. I really want to start by thanking the entire staff of the National Park Service, the Eisenhower Farm, for welcoming me here, Alice, Jason, Dan, and so many others for putting on this event today. And thank you all so much for coming out this morning. It's great to see so many people, but also so many friendly faces. So I'm really looking forward to the presentation today and the discussion afterwards for anyone who's interested in asking questions. I should start by saying that even though I am here in my official capacity as a naval historian, the views and opinions that I may express today are not necessarily those of the Department of Defense or the Department of the Navy. So now that disclaimer's out of the way. On June 6, 1944, American, British, Canadian, and other Allied forces launched the long-awaited invasion of Western Europe and Normandy, France. Floating 11 miles offshore, on his headquarters ship, Ancon, U.S. Army Major General Leonard Gerow spent the day anxiously listening to radio messages and trying to discern the progress of the amphibious landings through binoculars. Gerow's 5th Corps, comprising the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions, was tasked with establishing a beachhead on Omaha Beach, the most heavily defended sector of the 5 Allied landing sites on D-Day. There, German defenders killed thousands of Gerow's troops as they disembarked from their landing craft and attempted to scale the steep 100-foot bluff behind the beach. Smoke and dust limited the visibility, and radio communications were sporadic, but the limited information that reached Gerow seemed to confirm his worst pre-invasion fears about German obstacles and resistance on the beaches. The first wave of assault troops landed at precisely 6:30 a.m., but 3 hours later, General Gerow could only tell his superiors, quote, "Obstacles mined, progress slow." 11 hours later, Gerow was finally able to go ashore and join his men. Though the beach was in American hands, there was still sporadic German artillery and sniper fire. As the general landed, he saw burned ship hulls, knocked out tanks, dead American soldiers laid in rows awaiting burial, and hundreds of steel obstacles still limiting movement on the beach. Many things had gone wrong for Gerow's divisions that day, but his soldiers managed to fight their way off the beach thanks to tremendous personal courage and initiative. After observing the destruction of men and equipment, as well as the magnitude of the defenses they had overcome on Omaha, Gerow could not help but be struck by what a close-fought battle it had been. As soon as he reached a functional radio, Gerow hailed the 1st U.S. Army Group Commander, his boss, General Omar Bradley. Gerow's first words to Bradley from Omaha Beach were simply, "Thank God for the United States Navy." The U.S. Navy's role in the victory on D-Day is sometimes understandably overshadowed by the costly fight that U.S., British, and Canadian soldiers waged on the beaches and in the hedgerows of Normandy. But all of the heroic feats of arms accomplished by these men were made possible by the ships and sailors that carried soldiers, vehicles, and supplies to France. Soldiers, sailors, and Coast Guardsmen at sea swept mines, provided fire support, and ferried infantrymen to the beaches while constantly under enemy fire. Other American bluejackets joined the army ashore in the first waves as beachmasters, medics, and demolition experts. In these capacities and others, U.S. sailors played an essential part in establishing the Allied beachhead in Normandy, a contribution that was well understood by American commanders at the time, as illustrated by General Giroux's comment. In my remarks this morning, I will highlight some of the Navy's decisive contributions to the victory at D-Day. By the summer of 1944, the United States and Great Britain had already conducted a number of successful amphibious landings in the Mediterranean and Pacific theaters, including the invasions of Guadalcanal, North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and Tarawa. The invasion of Normandy, codenamed Operation Overlord, however, was to be by far the largest and most complex of these operations. A multinational invasion force consisting of soldiers, sailors, and airmen from more than a dozen nations, including the United States, Great Britain, Canada, France, Poland, Norway, and Czechoslovakia, had to establish a beachhead on the heavily defended French coast and then build up a force capable of breaking out faster than the German army could rush reinforcements to the area and contain the Allies as it had done at Anzio in Italy, or push the Allies back into the sea as had happened at Dunkirk in France 4 years earlier. After General Dwight Eisenhower took command of Overlord, he ordered the invasion plans expanded from a 3-division to a 6-division landing, supported by 3 more airborne divisions that would be dropped behind the beaches. In order to accommodate this expanded 130,000-man assault force and the rapid buildup of millions of follow-on troops, the Allies needed an unprecedented number of ships. Arguably the most important type of ship for ensuring the success of the Normandy invasion was the landing ship tank, commonly known as LST. LSTs were far from glamorous vessels. Upon being assigned to LST 338 and seeing the vessel for the first time, pharmacist's mate, Frank Federick of Scranton, Pennsylvania, exclaimed, quote, "Oh God, this can't be my ship. It's ugly." He thought he'd done something wrong. Despite the LST's boxy appearance, they were indispensable vessels that had a draft of less than 4 feet but could carry up to 2,100 tons of cargo. The LST was designed in November of 1941, shortly before the United States entered the war, and its most innovative feature was the doors in its bow that enabled it to directly discharge men and vehicles onto a beach after the ship intentionally ran up onto the sand at high tide. The United States, Great Britain, and Canada launched more than 1,000 LSTs during the war, and by 1944, American shipyards could build one in less than 2 months. But there were still never enough to meet the demands of a global war, and every ship counted. This was especially true in the spring of 1944, when the Allies were planning not only the invasion of Normandy, but also follow-up landings in southern France and on Saipan in the Pacific on June 15th. Consequently, the Joint Chiefs of Staff agreed to postpone the landings at Normandy from May to June of 1944, so that an additional 1 month's worth of LST production could reach Europe. General Eisenhower, whose house we're at today, told U.S. Army Chief of Staff General George Marshall that even, quote, 1 extra month of landing craft production, including LSTs, should help a lot. Commenting on the dire shortage of LSTs, a frustrated British Prime Minister Winston Churchill exclaimed to General Marshall in April of 1944, quote, "How it is that the plans of 2 great empires like Britain and the United States should be so hamstrung and limited by 100 or 2 of these particular vessels will never be understood by history." Marshall, in turn, declared that prior to the present war, he had never heard of any landing craft except for rubber boats. But now he thought about little else. By June 3rd, 1944, the assembled Allied fleet in ports along Great Britain's southern coast numbered nearly 7,000 ships and landing craft of all sizes. This armada included 284 major warships, 5 battleships, 23 cruisers, and more than 200 destroyers and destroyer escorts were among them. The invasion date was originally set for June 5th, but a storm in the English Channel compelled Eisenhower to postpone the landings for 24 hours. Soldiers and sailors were at a high state of readiness, and many ships had already slipped into the channel on the night of June 3rd when Eisenhower issued a recall order at 5 a.m. the following morning. Allied meteorologists informed the Supreme Commander that a storm with strong winds and cloud cover with a ceiling of just 300 feet was closing in on the channel. Based on this information, Eisenhower postponed the operation for one day, though it was not even clear if the weather would allow for the invasion to be launched on June 6th. As he recalled the ships to port, many of the sailors and soldiers aboard were now soaked with salt water and exhausted from the strain. On the night of June 4th, just 5 miles north of Portsmouth, England, in a 19th century manor house known as Southwick House, Eisenhower once again met with his deputies and chief meteorologist. With the rain and wind beating on the windows of the old mansion, Chief Meteorologist Captain James Skagg of the Royal Air Force gave Eisenhower a glimmer of good news. The weather would improve on June 6th, he said. Still, there was a great deal of risk if the operation went ahead on the 6th, because Skagg could not say exactly what the skies would be like over the beaches, even at this point, which would jeopardize, if they were locked in by clouds, it would jeopardize the effectiveness of Allied air power, which was crucial to the success of the invasion. Yet, if the Allies waited, the tides would not be favorable again for the operation to proceed until June 19th. Eisenhower polled his lieutenants for the operation, and they decided that it was a gamble that they had to take. Hopefully, the skies would clear enough for Allied air power to be effective in Normandy. Eisenhower gave the order to tentatively launch the invasion, and the Great Armada cast off on the approximately 100-mile journey to the waters off Normandy. At 4 a.m. on June 5th, he met with his commanders one last time to review the latest weather report. While Skagg informed Eisenhower that the wind would remain fresh and therefore cause choppiness in the channel, the meteorologist also told Eisenhower that the weather should improve throughout the day on the 6th. The 53-year-old general stood up, walked the room with his head bowed and his hands clasped behind his back. The officers present knew that this was a decision that only he could make. "Okay, we'll go," he solemnly declared. And with these words, there was no turning back. The fleet could no longer be recalled. In the vanguard of the multinational fleet sailed more than 300 minesweepers, tasked with clearing designated lanes of German mines. With the Allies firmly in control of the air and sea, German mines posed perhaps the greatest threat to ships bound for Normandy. The Germans had laid large minefields in the channel, consisting of moored mines and bottom mines that could be detonated by pressure, magnetic, or acoustic triggers. The minesweepers, one of the ways in which they detonated these mines was to drag large magnetic cables behind them. The cables that they dragged behind them would cut the mines if they were tethered to the channel floor, and then as the mines floated to the surface, accompanying vessels or the minesweepers themselves would shoot and destroy the mines. In order to ensure safe passage of Allied vessels, American and Royal Navy minesweepers swept and marked 10 lanes all the way across the channel, and then repeatedly rechecked these lanes in case the Germans sortied and laid additional mines with planes or fast boats. The critical task of clearing as many mines as possible took minesweepers well within German artillery range off the Normandy beaches in the early morning hours of June 6th, and they did not complete their initial sweep until just minutes before the transport ships began transferring soldiers to smaller landing craft. The Navy suffered some of the first casualties of the invasion when the U.S. minesweeper Osprey struck a mine just before 6 p.m. on the evening of June 5th. 6 sailors died in the explosion. 2 more minesweepers, plus 2 troop ships, a destroyer escort, and over a dozen landing craft were lost to mines in the invasion, but the losses could have been far greater. In total, minesweepers located and destroyed more than 800 mines during and immediately after the D-Day landings. The minesweepers were protected in their dangerous task by fast, wooden PT boats commanded by the same Medal of Honor recipient, Lieutenant Commander John Bulkley, who had rescued General Douglas MacArthur from the Philippines in March of 1942. Behind them came the destroyers and the destroyer escorts that patrolled the flanks of the columns to guard against German submarines and torpedo boats. In the center, LSTs, assorted transports, and purpose-built barges called rhinos which you can see behind this the Higgins boat in the front here, carried soldiers in their vehicles. Bringing up the rear of the column were two artificial harbors codenamed Mulberry that were constructed off of Omaha and Gold Beaches. They were protected by ships sunk in the channel to form a breakwater, and these were amusingly codenamed Gooseberries. I can talk about that more in the comments if you like. The 5 invasion forces, bound for their respective beaches and sailing from dozens of ports in the United Kingdom, rendezvoused a few miles south of the Isle of Wight, at a point many sailors jokingly called Piccadilly Circus, after the notoriously chaotic and congested traffic circle in central London. Though the rendezvous and subsequent channel crossing met no German opposition, it was still an unpleasant ordeal for most soldiers and sailors. U.S. Navy Lieutenant Howard Vanderbeek of Iowa recalled his experience on one landing craft. Quote, "The voyage seemed rough. It seemed endless. Channel weather was the worst in 20 years, so we struggled with a heavy sea and poor visibility. We crew members, weary and cold from the bitter winds and raw salt spray, were silent. Conditions on board weren't just difficult due to the 5 minutes after the barrage ended. The first waves of American landing craft touched down on Omaha and Utah beaches. Among the first Allied soldiers and sailors to set foot on French soil were members of the Navy's combat demolition units. All of the Normandy beaches were covered with obstacles, including buried mines, logs topped with mines, which you can see really well here in this photograph, and steel tetrahedrons made up of railroad iron, intended to rip the bottoms out of landing vessels. As a result, Army and Navy engineering teams were some of the first personnel to land on every beach, and they had to work quickly in order to clear the way for subsequent waves of troops. As Lieutenant Nathan Irwin, a member of a combat demolitions unit at Utah Beach, explained, quote, "We had to get in early in the morning because the tide was out and the obstacles were exposed. We had about an hour and a half before the tide would start coming in, so it was imperative we get our work done before that tide came in and covered up the obstacles." This was a tough job, but Irwin and other demolition men like him at Utah were able to plant explosives on the obstacles and clear out channels while contending primarily with mines and the rising tide. Demolition teams at Omaha Beach, however, faced considerably more difficulty. Famed war correspondent Ernie Pyle, who came ashore the following day, described what confronted the men who landed on Omaha Beach. Quote, "The Germans were dug into positions that they had been working on for months, although these were not yet all complete," Pyle explained. A 100-foot bluff, a couple of 100 yards back from the beach, had great concrete gun emplacements built right into the hilltop. These opened to the sides instead of to the front, thus making it very hard for naval gunfire from the sea to reach them. They could shoot parallel with the beach and cover every foot of it for miles with artillery fire. Then they had hidden machine gun nests on the forward slopes, with crossfire taking in every inch of the beach. These nests were connected by networks of trenches so that German gunners could move about without exposing themselves. None of the positions that Pyle observed on Omaha Beach were knocked out by the pre-invasion bombardment. When the Navy demolition teams at Omaha landed 3 minutes after the first landing craft touched shore, they and the other soldiers on the beach were subjected to murderous crossfire from rifles and mortars, as well as 30 pre-sighted artillery pieces and 85 machine guns atop the bluffs. And you can see in this photograph, that dark line in the background, that's the bluff that's overlooking the beach. And because they landed at low tide, the beach was exceptionally long, several hundred yards of open sand. 16 underwater demolition teams, each made up of 7 sailors and 5 soldiers, were assigned to blast boat channels 50 yards wide through the obstacles at Omaha, a challenge due to heavy fire and also the rising tide. One team was killed by enemy fire as it was landing. Another team's raft, full of explosives, was hit by an artillery round, instantly killing all but 1 man in the squad. The surviving team set to work, wrapping mined obstacles with volatile primacord and other explosives while under intense fire. In order to make sure that the mines on the obstacles detonated when they were destroyed, it was necessary for the demolitions men to sometimes shimmy up the logs or to stand on a comrade's shoulder and place charges directly next to the mines that were placed on the obstacles. This kind of dangerous work made a number of sailors fatalistic about their chances for survival. Death seemed to have no pattern on a beach strewn with explosives and raked with artillery and small arms fire. Lieutenant Commander Joseph Gibbons the commanding officer of the Navy Demolitions Unit on Omaha Beach, a man who received the Silver Star for his heroism that day, reflected after the landings how, quote, one gets rather fatalistic regarding operations of this nature. 3 of my officers were walking down the beach suffering 70% casualties. Navy combat demolition team members on Omaha Beach succeeded in clearing 10 lanes for landing craft to use by the end of D-Day. 2 days later, the Navy had cleared 85% of the obstacles on the entire beach. In recognition of their heroism, the Navy demolition units were awarded the Presidential Unit Citation, the highest honor that can be collectively bestowed upon a U.S. military unit. Unfortunately, the delay that German fire caused in clearing obstacles, combined with the difficulty in marking open channels, led follow-on waves of landing craft to suffer a high rate of casualties. Some of the vessels sank in the cleared gaps, further clogging up the beach. As soldiers struggled to climb the bluffs and demolition teams worked to clear mines and obstacles, other Navy personnel belonging to specialized beach battalions directed landing ships to open clearings and organized troops and vehicles that made it ashore. As Pharmacist's Mate 3rd Class Leo Shear of the 7th U.S. Naval Beach Battalion explained, the job of the beach battalions was to go ashore with invading troops and work between ship and shore. The battalions contained the beach master, mechanics, signalmen, doctors, and medics like Leo Shear. Shear's landing craft also hit a mine on its way to Omaha Beach. Once off the ship, Shear managed to get to cover and started treating the wounded. He recalled that, quote, the conditions under which we treated the wounded were brutal. We had no stretchers, so those who could not be moved lay where they were hit. We had no blankets either, so it was a good thing that the weather was not too cold. Shear and his fellow medical personnel scoured the beach for wounded men and set up an aid station in a trench dug on the beach. As empty landing craft prepared to return to the transports offshore, Shear and his fellow corpsmen loaded the wounded onto the boats for evacuation. Other beach battalion personnel worked to keep men and landing craft coming to shore. Boatswain's Mate 3rd Class Julius Schulers wrote that, quote, my job on the beach was to wade out into the water and locate channels for the small boats to use. Once I located a channel, I would place a flag on the beach to mark it, so that the coxswains could bring their cargo ashore safely. On the beach, I was constantly in danger of being hit by sniper fire. In the water, I was constantly being bumped by body parts that were just floating just under the surface. I tried to condition my mind to block out this horrible experience. I could not. By 8 a.m., the invasion at Omaha Beach had stalled, and thousands of men found themselves trapped by German machine gun and artillery fire and the rising tide. Exhausted and frequently wounded, unable to retreat, the soldiers and sailors huddled by the breakwater on Omaha Beach. They could only go forward, but ahead of them was certain death. The soldiers lacked artillery support or significant numbers of tanks, most of which had been sunk on their way to shore. As Ernie Pyle observed, our only exits from the beach were several swales or valleys, each about 100 yards wide. The Germans made the most of these funnel-like traps, sewing them with buried mines. They contained also barbed wire entanglements with mines attached, hidden ditches, and machine guns firing from the slopes. The German defenders had turned these natural draws into killing fields with pre-sighted artillery as well as fortified machine gun positions and entrenched infantry. That morning, thousands of American soldiers from the 1st and 29th Divisions faced death or capture unless they could make it to the top of the bluff. It was at this moment that their salvation came from the ships offshore. To avoid causing casualties among their own soldiers, the battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and other gunboats supporting the landing stopped firing on the beach just minutes before H hour, or the moment when the first troops landed. The U.S. Navy's Destroyer Squadron 18, made up of 9 Gleaves-class destroyers commanded by Captain Harry Sanders, held their fire and watched anxiously from several miles offshore as the first waves of American troops hit the beach. The plan on Omaha was for fire control teams and spotters to call for naval fire once they established themselves on the beach. However, the majority of the spotters' radios broke, were damaged by salt water, or were lost in the initial waves, and most of their operators were killed, leaving the surviving men on the beach with no way to call for assistance. Commander William McCall, on the destroyer Satyr Lee, expressed his frustration about the first hours of the invasion. Quote, it was most galling and depressing to lie idly a few hundred yards off the beach and watch our troops, tanks, landing boats, and motor vehicles being heavily shelled and not be able to fire a shot to help them. This brewing crisis lasted for about 2 hours. Eventually, though, destroyer captains, on their own initiative, ordered their main batteries to begin firing at targets on the beach, bluffs, and draws overlooking the trapped American troops. Unable to contact fire control streams on shore, destroyer crews relied on their own observations and fired at targets of opportunity, such as German fortifications. The destroyer McCook's log for June 6th reads in part, 8:39 a.m., commenced firing on pillbox which was delivering fire against beach. 8:58 a.m., ceased firing, pillbox demolished by direct hits. McCook's crew then brought their 5-inch main guns to bear on other targets. At 9:33 a.m., the log records, commenced firing on 2 guns which were set into cliffs and were enfilading the beach. 9:46 a.m., ceased firing, batteries appeared destroyed, 1 gun emplacement plunged from the cliff, other flew into air. Other destroyers joined the fray soon after McCook. Satterlee stayed close to Pointe du Hoc in support of the 2nd Ranger Battalion, a 200-man unit tasked with climbing a 110-foot tall cliff to destroy a German artillery emplacement. Satterlee got so close to support the Rangers that a German machine gun actually hit the ship. The destroyer's small-caliber, rapid-firing guns raked the top of the cliff, enabling the Rangers to climb it with less interference. After scaling the cliff, the Rangers got a radio working, so the Satterlee and the destroyers Thompson and Harding were able to fire at the Rangers' request. Gunner's mate 2nd Class James Jones of the Harding talked to a Ranger a few days after the invasion and wrote home that, quote, "The Rangers looked upon us as guardian angels, and every time we came on a firing run, they said, 'Here comes Harding again to knock out a few more.'" The individual initiative of destroyer captains was important, but finally, at 9 a.m., Destroyer Squadron 18's commanders, Harry Sanders, ordered all 9 of his destroyers to help the troops on the beach. And 50 minutes after that, Admiral Carleton Bryant, commander of all fire support ships at Omaha, radioed all of his ships. "Get on them, men, get on them. They are raising hell with the men on the beach, and we can't have any more of that. We must stop it." In response to these orders, the destroyers closed in to less than 1,000 yards from the shore and made repeated passes, firing at German positions on the cliffs, bluffs, and draws overlooking Omaha Beach. They risked grounding because of the shallow beach gradient, and repeatedly went outside of the marked channels cleared of mines in order to stay within firing range for as long as possible. When the Navy gunners were unable to spot German positions because of the smokeless powder used by the Germans, the sailors looked to see where U.S. tanks on the beach were firing and trained their own guns on the same locations. As Captain Sanders put it, quote, "It was good fun to watch for gun flashes, put a couple of 5-inch salvos on the target, and watch the Germans come running out with their hands stretched over their heads." The destroyer captains had orders not to expend more than half of their ammunition bombarding shore targets so that they could meet any emergencies that may arise if the Germans decided to sortie out with their own naval forces. But to a man, they all disregarded this order and continued firing as their gun mounts got so hot that they had to be hosed down. Some of them fired more than 1,000 rounds of 5-inch ammunition that day. The destroyer Frankfurt illustrates the impact these destroyers had. It reported, quote, "Troops on Easy Red were being held up by a mortar battery located on a ridge. After close observation, the exact location of the battery was noted at 10:32 a.m. At 10:36 a.m., commenced firing on the battery using direct fire, range about 1,200 yards. On the 5th salvo, a direct hit was obtained. A large cloud of green smoke was noted, and the mortar battery ceased firing. Our troops then advanced, and a number of German troops were seen to surrender." Years later, Sergeant Barton Davis of the 299th Combat Engineers wrote to the captain of the Frankfurt. And his letter said, "How well I remember your ship coming in so close. Your ship not only knocked out the pillbox, but also the mortar position above us. I always thought how great it would be to tell the captain of that ship how grateful I am." Gunfire like this enabled the Army to get off of Omaha Beach. It did not make the Army's job easy, but it did make it possible, and assured the soldiers on the beach that they were not alone. Over the course of the day, men on the beach established better communications and could call for systematic naval gunfire, but those critical hours of destroyer initiative saved lives and possibly the invasion. As the Navy's official history of the battle concluded, Destroyer Squadron 18's fire afforded the troops the only artillery support they had during most of D-Day. They filled the breach created by terrific loss of tanks and of amphibious trucks carrying Army guns. 1st Division Chief of Staff, Colonel Stanhope Mason, agreed. He wrote, "I am now firmly convinced that our supporting naval fire got us in, that without that gunfire we positively could not have crossed the beaches." D-Day, and particularly the assault on Omaha Beach, exemplified a large operation in which decisions by small groups of soldiers had far-reaching strategic impacts. The material superiority of the Allied invasion force in Normandy would have counted for little if small groups of soldiers had been unable to land on the beach and then breach the German defenses. When General Giroux thanked God for the United States Navy on the evening of June 6th, he knew that his soldiers could not have triumphed on Omaha Beach without the Navy demolition teams, beachmasters, coxswains, medics, mechanics, and destroyer crews that fought alongside them. Though perhaps not as dramatic as at Omaha Beach, this was true at Utah, Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches as well. Over the next weeks, the Normandy beachhead expanded with U.S. Navy logistical and fire support. The 15-mile range of the battleship's main batteries meant that they continued to provide fire support for soldiers fighting in the hedgerows of Normandy until the breakout into central France during Operation Cobra a full month later in July of 1944. After a subsequent Allied invasion in southern France in August, codenamed Operation Dragoon, and the Soviet Union's massive offensive codenamed Operation Bagration, Nazi Germany entered the fall of 1944 surrounded in the west by 1 million soldiers of the Allies, and in the east by 2 million Soviets. And they faced a reckoning for their many crimes. Omaha Beach did not foreshadow the quick end of World War II. Indeed, 1944 and 1945 were the bloodiest years of the war. But Americans and other Allied soldiers and sailors in Normandy renewed the hope of liberation for millions of Europeans suffering under Nazi occupation. 14-year-old Anne Frank, in hiding with her family in an attic in Amsterdam because she was Jewish, heard of the invasion on the day it occurred and wrote in her diary, "The best part about the invasion is that I have the feeling that friends are on the way. Those terrible Germans have oppressed and threatened us for so long that the thought of friends and salvation means everything to us." Sadly, Anne would never meet these friends, but her father, Otto Frank, did, as did millions of others across Europe. They, and we, are ever grateful for the soldiers and sailors that fought and died in Normandy 80 years ago. Thank you.
Right. Well, are there any questions in the crowd? If you'd like, you can raise your hand. I'll bring you the microphone. Any questions for Dr. Bamford? We got in the back. Sir?
Why were so many of the vehicles that landed on the beach lost that day?
That's a great question. So they were lost for a variety of causes. The landing craft carrying them were sometimes sunk. The ducks, DUKW, 2.5-ton trucks that were outfitted with amphibious rigs so that they could swim, they were lost due to overloading. The swells in the channel were riding at 4 feet waves, and a lot of these vehicles, the tanks especially, the DD tanks, they only had side clearance of about 9 to 10 inches. So they were quickly swamped by waters soaking over the side. Others were lost to German fire that was very accurate, and one hit on a truck carrying several hundred rounds of artillery ammunition, for example, and it was a total loss with everyone aboard. So it was, and those vehicles that did make it to shore were very conspicuous as well, and so they made even more targets for the German soldiers. So it was a lot of factors. Several of those tanks are still sunken off the beach today. But yeah, I can elaborate too if you need. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. I'll put this up too. So.
Thank you for a very interesting presentation.
Thanks,
It may be slightly out of your wheelhouse, because obviously you are an American naval historian, but can you talk a bit about the role of, for lack of a better word, the minor allies? Obviously Great Britain contributed a great deal, but I know there's a monument to the Norwegian Navy in Normandy. So I'm wondering if you could talk about the contributions of those nations.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your comment. The minor navies, as we think of them, especially what I told is more of an American story of D-Day, but for example, the Royal Navy contributed, almost all of the minesweepers. In the vast majority of 300, they contributed well over 250. So the minesweepers, the U.S. Navy actually contributed a fairly small number. A lot of the other nations that were overrun by Germany in 1940, Norway among them, their navies often, their ships, crews, fled. They evacuated to Great Britain and continued to fight, and as well as a number of individuals from such as Czechoslovakian pilots, Polish pilots that fought in the Battle of Great Britain, and then continued to fight here at D-Day as well. So their ships, the French had a number of cruisers and destroyers that fought not only at D-Day but then also in Operation Dragoon. And when I've given presentations on Dragoon too, and I'll be giving one next week in the French embassy. It was very difficult for French soldiers to fire on their own homeland. Think of that psychologically, how difficult that must be. But they had to look at it as they were liberating their own people. And so there was a great contribution from so many different, what we consider smaller nations, people who were there to fight the Germans to hopefully liberate their own countries one day. That didn't always come to pass. Polish, Czechoslovakian soldiers and sailors, for example, their nations just fell under communism at the end of World War II. So that was very difficult. But they did make significant contributions in a lot of areas that are underappreciated, I think. So it's very, very good every chance we get to highlight the contribution of allies. It was a multinational effort, and that makes it all the more complex and impressive that it came off as it did. Yes, sir. Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks for the presentation. I have a question about naval strategy.
Mm-hmm.
What were the Navy's key strategic takeaways from the D-Day landings and from supporting D-Day, and how did those change how they approached fighting the rest of the war?
Thanks very much. That's a great question. I think the biggest takeaways. So every amphibious operation is different, and Normandy is somewhat unique in that, not wholly unique. The operations in southern France also had a very short kind of convoy distance to travel, but I think in the Pacific, the Navy had to carry so much more of its equipment and baggage with it to the various islands, because the LSTs were making trips back and forth across the channel, carrying back German prisoners of war and wounded immediately to hospitals, sometimes Navy-operated hospitals in Great Britain, whereas in the Pacific they couldn't do that. They had to bring more hospital ships and things with them. I think the biggest takeaway in terms of strategy from Normandy, and this isn't something that was wholly unknown to the Navy, but it's naval gunfire support. That is critical because the naval bombardment in Normandy, like as I mentioned, was only 40 minutes long, and that just wasn't long enough. And then there was also an over-reliance on aircraft bombardment. And a lot of the aircraft bombs that were used at Normandy were only 100-pound bombs, and the thought being that they didn't want to drop bombs that were too big because it might create craters too big on shore that would then provide obstacles for the vehicles that made it ashore. So a lot of these compounded factors made the landings at Omaha into a near disaster. But part of the takeaways from Normandy was that they needed more naval gunfire for pre-invasion landings, and they did in fact do that. That was also a lesson that was learned very hardly and at a great cost at Tarawa too. And so that's why when you do get to the later invasions in late 1944, 1945, especially in the Pacific, multiple days of bombardment. Of course, it's very easy for us to armchair general that sort of thing and say they should have bombarded it for longer at Normandy, but it was also a time factor. It was get the soldiers ashore and get them into a position that was defensible, because they didn't know how fast the Germans would be able to move that armored division that was in Normandy to attack. And because if it came too soon and if they weren't ready, there was the potential for disaster. In retrospect, however, it should have at least been a 2 to 3 hour bombardment. And they had done this at some of the other landings in the Mediterranean too, but it was a decision, a strategic decision. They weighed the pros and cons. Same thing landing at low tide. But again, that's something that didn't factor into every invasion. At Omaha Beach, they landed at extreme low tide so that they could destroy the obstacles. At Tarawa, they landed not quite at full high tide, and they really needed full high tide to get over the reef. Well, there's no coral reef in Normandy, so there's a lot of different factors there. But so Yeah, but these lessons were all written. These were all compiled in after-action reports. They did this after every operation. I've read the one for the post-action for Operation Dragoon. It's several hundred pages long. It's like, what did we learn? What did we do right? And they tried to absorb these. Every commander was responsible for overseeing that after the battle. So it's a great question. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Yeah, it's very interesting to think about. Yes, sir.
Again, thanks for a very informative talk.
Thank you.
I heard you mention before your talk today that you spent time at the National World War II Museum, which evolved out of the National D-Day Museum. And my understanding is that location was selected because of the Higgins boats, which were manufactured there. For those of us who would like to learn more by spending time in museums and more specifically about the role of the U.S. Navy in World War II, can you recommend some other, two questions.
Yeah.
How long do you need to see the entire World War II Museum in New Orleans? Do you need a day, a week, for those of us who haven't been there, and I haven't? And what other museums stateside, or in England or France, focus on the role of the Navy, or navies in World War II?
How much time do you have? So, first question. So the National World War II Museum, formerly the National D-Day, the National D-Day Museum. That's about a 4-block campus that they have down there, and they actually finished a building just as I left that I helped with the galleries for, a phenomenal Liberation Gallery. I would say to see if you're a history buff, which I'm assuming that you all are, I would say you probably need at least 2.5 full days, possibly 3, to really absorb all of it. There's theaters, there's movies, 3D experiences that are part of it now. So you could probably do it in 2 if you were rushing. So the other museums that focus on the Navy, I wish I could recommend the National Museum of the U.S. Navy, but we are in the process of building a new one. So we've got the land, and we're now in the fundraising stages for that. So that's going to be a couple years before I can recommend that one. There's a fantastic Naval Air Museum down in Pensacola. The Seabee Museum is out in California. I've not been to that one though, but I hear it's excellent. But the Seabees were pretty instrumental in building those artificial harbors that I alluded to at D-Day. In Great Britain, the Imperial War Museum in London is very good. There is a Navy Museum in London. I think it's in Portsmouth, but I can't recall exactly. But I've heard that that's also very, very excellent. I'm afraid I haven't been to enough museums on the continent to recommend those, but I'm sure that there are some very good ones in Normandy, especially. I'm aware that there's good ones, and you may have been there. You may have seen those more than I have, actually. So those would be my must go to. Completely unrelated, the National World War I Museum, also phenomenal museum.
Yeah, we've been there.
Yeah, the World War II Museum is also fantastic, great, but it's kind of like you make it a twofer because Missouri and New Orleans, they're right next door, neighbors. Distance is nothing in the western part of the country. So, but yeah, thank you so much. I wish I could give you more details on that one. But any other questions? Yeah. Yes, sir. Sure.
Yeah, thanks very much. I just got one comment and one easy question, but
Okay.
I don't know if people are aware of it. Out in Du Bois, Wyoming, has been most recently built a National Military Museum of National War Vehicles.
Yes,
It takes about 2 days to go through, but it's really a good museum. It covers all the wars.
Okay.
But the blimps, the Zeppelins, what were the purpose of those things?
Okay. Yeah. That's a great question. So what you're seeing here is actually anti-aircraft balloons. They're barrage balloons, they were called. And so the thinking is that if a German aircraft, like a fighter plane, came over the landing field or over the landing zone with all of these ships here, their wings would get hit by the wires here, and it would take them down. So it would prevent them from flying at an optimal angle for attacking them. These balloons were actually, a lot of them were actually manned and run by an African-American unit that performed very gallantry on D-Day. These balloons, even though the Allies had aerial superiority over the landing beaches, it was still a great fear because aerial attack of this much concentration of shipping could have been disastrous. And so they just didn't know how much the Germans would resist it. As it turned out on D-Day itself, not that much at all. But yeah, and so you'd see this in land when they were gathering in England too. there would often be barrage balloons. They were actually fairly common throughout the war. But yeah, they're just large balloons. Yeah, so it's the cables. That's the real part of it. That's the defensive part of it. Yeah, well, it's a good question. Now, yeah, if you've never seen them before, they look real strange. Yeah.
Oh,
Yes.
I think we got one more question.
Yes.
So the balloons, once they got to the beach, did they let the balloons?
No, they held them there for days and weeks afterwards. Nope, they stayed up.
Did they travel across the channel?
Oh, yes. No, usually not. No, they usually inflated them once they got.
Inflated them once
Yeah.
they got,
Okay. Sorry. I don't know what your question was. Yes. Yeah. So, yeah.
Do you want to wrap us up with, you promised a story about the gooseberries.
Okay. Well, sure. Yeah. I don't think I have a slide on that one actually. Let's see. Nope. Okay. So off of Omaha and I believe it was Juneau, but someone might correct me on that one. So off of one of the British beaches and of Omaha, the Allies constructed two artificial harbors called mulberries. They brought these with them. They consisted of concrete caissons, basically concrete towers that were brought over from England, towed with, and then sunk several miles offshore. Then from these caissons would be floating causeways on pontoon bridges, and then protecting the whole thing were the gooseberries, which were dozens of ships that were sunk, brought over, and then purposely sunk in a crescent shape, protecting the mulberries from the harsh conditions. The reason they were brought over in the first place is because the weather, especially in June, July in Normandy, is not known to be very calm. They knew that the waves would be very rough. Some portions of this harbor are still there today. But true to form, on June 19th, a very violent storm hit the landing sites and all but destroyed the mulberry at Omaha Beach. The one on the British beach did survive and continued to be put into use. But these were very critical. And the reason is because you could land vehicles, especially on those harbors from ships, and not have to beach the ships. You can see how these LSTs here are on complete dry land. So these are stationary, very large, valuable stationary targets for the better part of 12 hours before the hot tide comes in again and they can back off. So if you're unloading from a harbor, you can do it faster and your ship doesn't have to stay in one place for as long. So that's where the value of them came in. And the D-Day invasion did not take a French port, and they didn't capture the port of Cherbourg for more than a month after D-Day. So that was really critical to have this capability. And then once they did capture Cherbourg, they also laid an underwater pipeline to get fuel oil from England to France too. So there's a lot of thought that goes into the logistics. Are really, the less glamorous, but such an important part of operations like this. There's a saying that amateurs study battles or tactics, and professionals study logistics. A little bit, but it's very important, and that's probably what kept Eisenhower awake at night just as much as the soldiers on the beaches and and the weather primarily of all. I kind of couldn't help but be struck by the overcast nature of today and the rain last night. It was very fitting to give a talk on June 1944 in this weather. So again, thank you all so much for coming out today. I really appreciate it.
If you want a true experience of what the soldiers experience, go see Saving Private Ryan.
A fantastic movie. I mean, really the movie about D-Day, yeah. Absolutely. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out today. Yes, sir.
All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome here to the Eisenhower National Historic Site and our World War II weekend. It is my great privilege to introduce our next guest speaker, a good friend of the Eisenhower National Historic Site. But 80 years ago, hell was 4 miles above the earth. Into the Cold Blue is the memoir of B-24 pilot John Homan, who endured 34 combat missions over Europe in 1944. In 2024, Homan co-authored his memoir over with Dr. Jared Frederick, sharing his stories of the air war in Europe, and one of the last great memoirs of the Second World War. Dr. Frederick joins us to share Homan's story and shed light into the dangerous missions, exhilarating experiences, and dedication to freedom shared by Homan in his memoirs. Dr. Jared Frederick has a lifelong passion for American history. Prior to his current position as a history professor at Penn State Altoona, Frederick served as a park ranger at Gettysburg National Military Park and Harpers Ferry National Historic Park. He is the author of several books, including Dispatches of D-Day, A People's History of the Normandy Invasion, Hang Tough, The World War II Letters and Artifacts of Major Dick Winters, and Fierce Valor, the true story of Ronald Spears and his band of brothers. He has appeared on C-SPAN, PBS, numerous National Park Service productions, and various documentaries. In 2019, he acted as a guest host on Turner Classic Movies for the channel's 25th anniversary. He is also the host of the popular YouTube channel Real History, which examines history versus Hollywood. His latest book, Into the Cold Blue, explores the World War II experiences of co-author and B-24 veteran pilot John F. Homan. It's my privilege to hand over the podium to Jared. Oh no! Look at that as soon as we...
Okay.
All right.
Bravo. Thank you. Thank you all for joining me this afternoon, or this morning rather, at the wonderful Eisenhower National Historic Site, one of my favorite places to visit here in Gettysburg. So thank you to all of you for your dedication to history. I've written a number of books on the Second World War, but about 2 years ago, I determined that I very much wanted to write a book with, and not merely about, a World War II veteran. And I did this realizing that the opportunity to do so was quickly diminishing. Of the 16 million Americans who wore military uniforms during the Second World War, there are only about 75,000 of them that are left. And so we have less than 1% of our World War II veterans remaining, and the opportunities to collect those stories are quickly diminishing. That leads us to the gentleman who we see up on the screen, a spry young lieutenant 80 years ago, now a very sharp 100-year-old man who, though all initially hesitant to share his story, had trust in me to impart his experience, his year-long odyssey with you, readers, a broader audience. And I'll start off with a little bit of geographic context here for us. And we'll start by taking a look at the map. This was the area of operations for the United States Army Air Force's 8th Air Force. And at 1 o'clock this afternoon, you'll have the opportunity to hear John Orloff, screenwriter of Masters of the Air. And by 1945, the 8th Air Force truly was a master of the air over Western Europe. What we see here on the map are not only countries, but cities in which John Homan flew over, bombed, or dropped supplies to, or sometimes over which missions were scrubbed. So I think this little bit of geographic context is very valuable for us as we start off, just to underscore the vastness of this theater of operation. Our story, though, does not begin in Western Europe. It begins in Bath, Maine on January 5th, 1924. That is when John Homan comes into the world, and one of the earliest photographs that we have of him is this adorable little portrait of him sitting atop a pony. And I think I have a photo of my own grandfather sitting atop that same pony by the traveling photographer. That was a very popular thing to do with your children in the 1920s. And from an early age, by the time John was in 4th or 5th grade when the photograph on the left was taken, his family had moved to Sayreville, New Jersey, where his grandfather was employed in a gunpowder plant located there. They had endured a fairly rough existence during the time period of the Great Depression, as had many American families, but that did not stifle John's sense of adventure or daring. By the time he was a teenager, he had joined a band of misfits, a local gang that was known as the Roamers, who looked very similar in my imagination to the sort of slick-haired, leather jacket-wearing bad boys that we see in the photograph on the right. And some of John's misadventures we chronicle in the book. Others he told me we had to censor because he didn't want to send a bad impression to his great-grandson, who was about this age at the same time. But one of the most wonderful stories of his upbringing is my conversation that I had with him about his adventure to the 1939 World Fair in New York City. He's the only person I've ever met who had the chance to go to the World's Fair. And what impressed him most at the World's Fair was Jimmy Lynch and his daredevil drivers. These were stunt drivers, and John very much aspired to that sort of flair and exuberance. So much so that he determined that he was going to try to replicate some of the daredevil's maneuvers with his dad's Willie's car on the sand dunes of New Jersey. And so one night he mustered up the courage to try this, and he decided that he was going to try to make the car go airborne, jump off of one dune and land on another. Unfortunately, it did not work out as anticipated, and rather than landing on the opposite dune, he landed on the gully in between, thereby breaking the suspension on his father's car. And as John sheepishly admitted to me during our interviews, he said that car never drove straight ever again. John had never been in an airplane by that point, even as the Second World War had started. He had never even been in an airplane, let alone contemplated the possibility of learning how to fly an airplane. But here, we see that he had the desire to go airborne, and that desire wasn't going to diminish anytime soon. When Pearl Harbor was bombed on December 7th, 1941, many of John's friends within the Roamers were 18 years of age, but John was one of the younger members of that gang, and therefore he had to wait. There was no way that his mother was going to allow him to enlist with the parental permission at age 17, so he was going to have to play a waiting game. And even when he turned 18 years of age and was legally able to enlist of his own ambition, his mother still did not want him to join up. And even though he could have enlisted anyway, he very much loved his mother. He did not wish to defy her wishes. And as a result, he hatches up a daring plan. He goes to his local draft board and he says to them, he tries to make a secretive agreement with them. And he says, if you would, please call my draft number. I want you to draft me. I can't enlist transparently, so I want to be drafted. And they agreed to do this. And they made an unwritten pledge with him that they were going to abide by this secret pact. And so John was feeling very strong and very confident about himself. And he thought, I'm going to get away with it. My draft number will be called soon enough. And then he was disappointed and shocked to find this little bit of news piece in his local periodical on January 15th, 1943. And that article said 5 men were withdrawn from the list of those to be sent to Newark by the local draft board Tuesday for examination. John F. Homan of 16 Henry Street, Parlin, who appeared before the board requesting that he be admitted to the Army at once, was added to the list. And with that, the cat was out of the bag. That is how his mother found out that he was joining up in the United States Army, and she was none too pleased when he got home. But in any case, he was in the Army now, as the old saying goes, and the photograph on the left there is his high school graduation photograph. Because of the popularity and demand of the United States Army Air Forces, though, they required some sort of college education or technical training before you could enter. And therefore, John had to enter the infantry before he could get into the Air Forces. And he had to take a lot of schooling and night courses once he was in the Army. But he is able to work his way through that, and he is eventually able to work his way to aviation cadet school. And he will do most of that schooling at various air bases in Alabama, including Moody Field and what is now Maxwell Air Force Base. And during some of his downtime, he might have the opportunity to venture to Montgomery, Alabama, And that is where he is seated in this picture in front of the Alabama State House, right next to the statue of Confederate President Jefferson Davis, no less. This photograph was the favorite of John's girlfriend named Irene, the girl who he left behind back in New Jersey. She thought that this photograph evoked a certain boyish charm. And then when he got home in 1945, she was absolutely shocked that this young boy had disappeared. And in her view, he had grown into somewhat of a haggard, middle-aged man. And so this photograph serves as a very valuable lesson in contrast and aging and what war does to our facial features for those who endure it. But you may be able to spot here in the foreground of the photograph that he is wearing a small ring on his pinky finger, and that was a good luck token given to him by Irene, and he would wear that ring on every combat mission that he flew in the subsequent year. Before he learns to start to fly the big heavy bombers, he's starting out with some very notable training aircraft that was made available to him in Alabama and later on in Georgia. One of his favorite of these was the Boeing PT-17 Stearman, which we see in the upper left-hand corner, which is usually painted a very distinctive yellow or blue, so it could be easily recognizable during these training purposes. In the photograph in the middle, we see John in his flight suit on the far left, right after a briefing, getting ready to head off into the cold blue once more here. Where he spent a good bit of time training is the postcard that he sent to Irene that we see in the background. This is Souther Field in Americus, Georgia. And while he was at Souther Field, he also learned how to fly the BT-13, which he did not hold in as high regard as the Stearman. In fact, he referred to the BT-13 as the Vultee vibrator because he said it seemed like you were trying to fly a lawnmower because of how much that it would be shaken. He said we had to put additional cushions in the seats because we were all too short to reach the pedals that were at the bottom front of the cockpit. And suffice it to say, he did not have a high opinion of the Vultee. But he overcomes all of these challenges, he completes his training, and in January of 1944, he earns his commission as a second lieutenant in the Army Air Forces, and he also gets his highly covetous flight wings, and even better yet, his very stylish chocolate Class A dress uniform. This is what he aspired to attain most. This sets him in a whole other class of distinction. And he said corporals and sergeants weren't going to be yelling at me anymore. And that was one of the things that he was very eager to embrace. The first thing that he does when he gets back to New Jersey and has 2 weeks leave after he obtains his commission is that he goes to a photography studio where a good friend works. He takes his girlfriend, Irene, with him, and he has a series of portraits taken. So he's a bit enamored with himself in some of these images. He has 6 different pictures taken, and some of them he's wearing his crusher cap. There's others that he's holding a pipe. He looks very debonair in all of them. And I said, John, what was the catalyst for this sort of excitement? What was your aspiration in being a photo boy as such? And he said, well, I couldn't grow a mustache, but I nonetheless wanted to be like Clark Gable. That is exactly what he wanted to do. So, yeah, 2 very debonair young men here, I think we could say. And I'm happy to say that John still has that uniform today, and there he is, standing next to it 80 years later. To his regret, he can no longer fit in his uniform. But as I was helping him to put it on a mannequin and put it on display in promotion with our book, he was sitting in there in the chair as I was dressing it up, and he said, damn, that still looks good. So he is still a bit enamored with his uniform all of these years later. And you'll notice that there are a number of ribbons that are later affixed to that uniform jacket as well. And we're going to be talking about how he will be getting some of those ribbons in our forthcoming slides. One thing, though, that John stressed to me was that he didn't want this merely to be a book about him. He is not a braggadocious sort of person. He's very humble. He's very reserved. Not once, as I was conducting dozens of hours of interviews with him, did he get emotional, did he break down, did he get tearful. He's very matter of fact. In any case, he said, I don't want this to be merely a story about me. I want it to be a story about my crew. And I want the story of our crew to be representative of the airman experience during the Second World War. And that's what I set out to do ultimately. And I had a great stroke of luck in the fact that I was able to find personal records, reminiscences, diaries, and flight logs of 3 of his crewmates at the National Museum of the Mighty 8th Air Force in Savannah, Georgia, combined with the mountain of material that John has in his personal possession. And so to have written accounts of 4 men within a 10-man crew, as far as I know, is fairly unparalleled. And so I had a vast treasure trove of material to work with. And it is my hope that I gave these 10 men justice. The 4 lieutenants that we see in the back, John is second from the left, and the 6 sergeants that we see in the foreground. These men were very much a family, and I'll be imparting to you some of their stories of camaraderie here very shortly. I'll first introduce you, though, to the plane that they flew, and that is the B-24 Liberator. And it is still a fierce, if not playful, debate among World War II veterans and aviation fans today of what is the better airplane of the Second World War, the B-17 or the B-24. Certainly, the B-17 might have a little bit more maneuverability. It is not quite as gangly as the B-24. Some pilots called the B-24 the ruptured duck. John Lucky Luckadoo of the 100th Bomb Group, he said that the B-24 was the box that the B-17 was mailed in. And that's how he kind of playfully describes it. But all that said, despite its somewhat awkward appearance, it has greater fuel range than the B-17, and it also has a heavier bomb load than the B-17. And in certain circumstances, that could benefit you in the long run. In this chart, which we have at the beginning of the book, outlines where each of the 10 crewmates was positioned within the aircraft, so readers can have easy reference so we don't get characters or positions mixed up. But John is located at position number 5. He is the co-pilot for 2 different B-24s in the European theater of operation. His crew is assembled in Casper, Wyoming in late 1943, and he said there was nothing like training in Wyoming during wintertime. But by May of 1944, they are given instructions to fly to Site X. They don't know necessarily where Site X is, though they are given the coordinates for it. So in mid-May of 1944, they start leapfrogging their way across the continental United States from Wyoming, through the Midwest, up to New England, until they ultimately find themselves in Goose Bay, Labrador. A massive airstrip had been constructed in Labrador there over the previous year to accommodate this huge flow of air traffic that will be funneling across the North Atlantic. And that is where they begin their journey to the European theater. It was somewhat of a precarious mission. It's 14 hours long. And at one point, they put the aircraft on autopilot and everybody falls asleep aboard the ship. So a bit nerve-wracking if you would ask me. But nonetheless, they made it. One really good incentive to try to stay awake, as John said, I looked out the cockpit window and it was just one continuous flow of ice. And he said if we crashed into that, we realized that there was no way of saving us. So a very memorable flight here across the Atlantic, and that was the only time that he would fly across the Atlantic in the co-pilot's seat. They eventually end up at a base in East Anglia that will be called Halesworth. And they arrive in the United Kingdom around Memorial Day, 1944. And immediately, John senses that there is something massive afoot. All of the officers on these bases were ordered to wear their sidearms. There's a certain energy and there's a certain hustle that can be felt on these air bases. And a few days later, John finds out why. Because he arrives in the United Kingdom about 1 week, less than a week in fact, before D-Day, June 6th, 1944. John had very much hoped that his crew would have the opportunity to participate in what General Eisenhower called the Great Crusade. But unfortunately, when they arrived in the United Kingdom, their plane was taken away from them and given to another crew. They had been used as nothing more than glorified delivery boys to take a plane for another outfit. And as a result, he had to sit out the onset of the Normandy invasion, something that I think still to an extent disappoints him to this very day. But there was still plenty of war left to be fought, and John was going to be front and center in it. All of those missions were going to originate out of here, the Halesworth airfield, not too far away from Norwich in the United Kingdom. This is an aerial photograph showing us what that airstrip looked like. And you'll notice all these sort of round pockets that originate out of one of the runways. Those are called hard stands. Those were glorified parking spaces for these B-24s, and it allowed the Army Air Forces to space out the planes on the bases. The Army had learned the hard way at Pearl Harbor, where all of the heavy bombers and aircraft had been parked together in close proximity to guard against the possibility of sabotage. And they quickly found out the downside of that once the Japanese attacked it. And so the strip was purposely spread out over a fairly large geographic area, and that was to prevent accelerated damage in case the Germans became very bold and decided to launch an air raid against this strip or other strips. You can still sense the footprint of the Halesworth airfield today. We can kind of see the original runways there that intersect with one another down here where the red pin is. There is a memorial museum dedicated to John's group, the 489th Bomb Group. Interestingly enough, though, it is largely now a solar and wind farm. And that is used almost as a point of pride by the local population because they make the argument that in 1944, this site was a place of cutting-edge technology, and they kind of advertise it as such today. So it's not necessarily the best preserved of World War II air bases that we can find in England, but it's certainly not the worst preserved either. One of the other really wonderful benefits of teaming up with John is the vast amount of period photography that he has. He had a camera with him. And this is perhaps my favorite photograph that he took. And he took it within his barracks. And the original photo was only about 1 inch by 1.5 inches. And when you scan it at 2,400 dots per square inch, you can make it big enough to plaster up on a wall. And we have these beautiful images. And I've since been able to connect with the family members of many of John's crewmates. And it's been a very rewarding experience for me to be able to send these photographs on to the grandchildren and children of these individuals, photographs that they had never seen before. And it's like bringing the past to life to a little bit. But the young man that we see sitting on this cot is John Dalglish, whose nickname was Pup, and he was the bombardier on John's plane. And John said that Pup was a little bit of a loner. He didn't always mix well with others. And while they might be playing poker in the barracks, Pup would just kind of go sit in the corner and sit there by himself quietly. And lo and behold, the photograph that I find of him here in the mix shows exactly that. And I am quite certain that is a serious poker game going on there in the background. And all the shoes in the foreground. It's a wonderful literal snapshot of airman life in England in 1944. There are some remnants of other features of the base that still exist. Some of the brick yet overgrown walls of the headquarters building. The Norden bomb site storage area, which was considered one of the best kept secrets of the war. Cutting edge technology, a predecessor of an analog computer that would allow supposedly for greater precision bombing. Technology that was so sophisticated that they would take it out of the bombers at night after the planes arrived back, and they would put them under lock and key and military police guard until the next mission. part of that still remains. Some of the best preserved buildings on base is where John began every morning. And that was the Combat Mess Facility, which is now a construction firm there on the property. But the inside of one of those buildings would have looked very much like this. And not only did I learn about base life, but I also learned about the airman diet. These are the sort of minuscule everyday things that John was able to impart to me. And one thing that he said that surprised me is that airmen could not be fed beans, cabbage, or gas-producing foods. And that sounds very funny at first, like did they not want to stink up the plane? Like what was the motivation behind that? But in reality, when you're flying at 20,000 feet in an airplane that doesn't have any compressed air, that sort of food can create acute gastrointestinal distress. And airmen could actually become sick or incapacitated as a result of that pain. And so even what they ate every morning had to be calculated and carefully pre-planned. It speaks to the sort of precision that they had in mind. This, though, is John's office, and his chair would have been the one on the right. It's something that John told me is as they were on the flight line, waiting for planes ahead of them to take off, he would close his eyes, he would run his hands up the consoles, across the panel, down the console, in the middle, and to the front, and he would memorize where every knob, lever, and button and gauge was located. And he did this to train himself, so if he found himself in a rough situation, he could immediately go to that button or switch to rectify one situation or another. So he was always preparing for this sort of worst case scenario. And I think it also speaks to one of the inherent ironies of military service during World War II. He's 20 years old as he's flying these missions. In 1944, as this is today, he couldn't buy a beer if he wanted to. In 1944, he also couldn't vote as well. That's still a few years away. Yet, he is entrusted with a $300,000 aircraft to rain war and destruction upon the enemy. You know, kind of the strange limitations of American civic life, I think. This is how many of those airmen would dress. Pretty much look like Eskimos. And they would have these large, often fleece-lined or sheepskin wool-lined suits that were also electrified. And they would be able to plug these suits or the underwear within them into outlets at the various stations within the plane. And there was a literal thermostat beside each station that allowed them to be protected against the sometimes sub-zero, certainly freezing temperatures that were located outside. You often wear a flak vest on top of that to try to protect you from bits of shrapnel, and then you would pang out the ears and put additional like Mickey Mouse ear flaps on top of a typical infantryman helmet, so your radio equipment and gas mask could fit more comfortably underneath. John flies his first mission on July 6th, 1944, exactly 1 month after D-Day, and initially he thinks, this combat mission stuff isn't so rough. I can do this. I can handle it. But he changes his mind completely on July 7th, 1944. This is his true wake-up moment as to what the horrors of combat entail. His group lost a number of planes. He saw them being shot down firsthand. Many more were gravely damaged. And there was one B-24 that was heavily damaged in this encounter that came up to his right wing. And what John noticed is that the top turret on that plane was completely shattered. It had been fully blown away. And stemming from that blown away turret was a streak of blood that went the whole way to the tail of the plane. It beheaded and completely eviscerated the gunner who was within that position, and his remnants were smeared the whole way to the rear of the plane. And John said that was something that always stayed with me. And even years later, that was one of the few really gory sights that would come back to him in his dreams. And it wasn't until we were writing this book that John learned the identity of that young man who was killed over Aschersleben, Germany on July 7th, 1944. And it was this sergeant right here whose name was Paul W. Redden. So to speak about this fatality in the abstract is one thing. To put a human face to it is something entirely other. Paul Redden was about to celebrate his first wedding anniversary. So he never had the opportunity to celebrate a wedding anniversary with his wife. He was 21 years of age. And it's important that as we think about these huge air armadas, that we not think of them in terms of statistics, that we think of them in the context of the personal. I think that's a fine way to memorialize these individuals. To blow off steam, John, his crew, and many other crewmates head to London. Incredibly cosmopolitan. John said it was the city that never slept. And he recognized this international coalition that was there. And he said there were Australians and Poles and Dutch and South Africans, people from all over the globe. And he realized then and there, wow, this really is a world war. This really is a vast allied coalition that is waiting for these big leaps in the United Kingdom. It was also there where John began to recognize the civilian costs of the war, thanks in no small part to these flying contraptions, the V-1 flying bomb and the V-2 flying rockets launched by the Germans on the main continent. They fly across the English Channel or the North Sea. John referred to them as "to whom it may concern" weapons, because once they run out of fuel, they plummet to the ground and they strike anywhere indiscriminately. And John was able to get this photograph where we see just entire city blocks of London that have been leveled by these so-called buzz bombs. As a matter of fact, this young lieutenant that he photographed in here is named Robert E. Crotty, and his plane was shot down a mere 2 weeks after this photograph was taken, and he became a prisoner of war for the duration of the conflict. On a brighter note, John took a great enjoyment in the sights and scenes to be found here, in this place, in Piccadilly Circus. This was the true hub of activity for Allied service members. If you were of a certain adventurous persuasion, this was the place where you could easily find prostitutes and where to find out information on the brothels in London, which John assured me that he never took part, and I believe him. But also, these were great venues and opportunities to horse around with your crewmates. Like I said, blow off steam. And this is another great photograph of his crew that John took of a bar in London, and it really underscores that sense of brotherhood. And he said, even though in a strict sense, the lieutenants and the sergeants should not have palled around with one another, he said, we ignored that entirely. And when we tried to take our sergeants into officers' clubs, we would usually be chased out by the MPs who insisted that our fellow comrades had to leave. It speaks to that sense of camaraderie. And this leads to perhaps my favorite story in the book. Because during one leave in London, the four officers determined that they were going to find a nice cozy nightclub to go to, share a bottle of scotch with one another. And sure enough, they found this shady, speakeasy-looking place where they had to give a password in order to get in. They go down into this dark basement. They get a table right at the front of the stage. There's a performer who's up on the platform who is singing a song. And shortly after the lieutenants sit down, a bottle is flung out of the audience and hits the performer in the face. And the male singer concluded his song, but when he finished, he called out to the audience. He said, the man who threw that bottle ought to be man enough to stand up and admit it. At that very same moment, there was an intoxicated Dutch paratrooper who was in the back of the room who did not speak English and stood up at that very same time to use the restroom. The MC in the club interpreted that as a confession of guilt on the part of that paratrooper, comes over and punches him in the face. An American paratrooper sergeant who is sitting in the other corner will not tolerate such an assault on one of his paratrooper brethren, even if he's from another country. He rises up and goes over and punches the MC in the face for punching the Dutch paratrooper. You get a sense where this is going. In true Hollywood fashion, the entire bar breaks out in an inter-service, international brawl. And John said, we just wanted to have a drink of scotch. And suddenly we found ourselves amidst a new Allied offensive in this bar. The four of them, though, continued to just sit there, take sips of their scotch, and saw the mayhem unfold around them. The name of that bar, appropriately enough, was the Nut House. That's the name of the chapter in which we talk of that book. But in the following days, it was back to business. And in late July of 1944, in reaction to the stalemate that is happening in Normandy hedgerow country, the 8th Air Force, including John's bomb group, is tasked to participate in Operation Cobra. This would be a series of saturation bombings that would break up the German defenses within Normandy and open up a thoroughfare to allow the Allied advance to continue moving. And bombs were dropped here with great effect. The German defenses are broken up, and these aerial photographs really speak to the level of devastation that is inflicted there. Unfortunately, one of the infamous downsides of these series of missions is that several hundred American GIs on the ground were killed by friendly fire by their own bombs. And this is where a twist of irony comes into our story, because one of the people in proximity to this incident was my own grandfather, serving in the 4th Infantry Division at this very same time. So definitely a little bit of irony there. And I told John that little factoid, and he said, well, I'll be damned. And he's glad none of the bombs fell on my grandfather's vicinity, for sure. This is not to say that the Air Forces wasn't having a lot of damage on such missions as well. The photograph in the upper left is a very vivid bit of testament to this fact. Some of these planes came back to Halesworth looking like big hunks of Swiss cheese with holes in them. And somebody else that John wanted to give credit to were the ground crews, the mechanics, because he said our missions would not have been possible without them. And they worked by day, we flew by night, and it was just a constant cycle of motion and energy. And so that's another segment that he wanted to give credit to. By the time we get to August 6, 1944, John flies lucky mission number 13, striking the oil refineries at Hamburg. And we can see those facilities on fire on the left-hand side of this screen. This was another incredibly grueling mission that the 489th Bomb Group went through. And John saw a number of B-24s explode in midair into these massive fireballs. And he said the wings would often just fold in on themselves and then go at a death spiral. And he said in so many instances there was just no chance for anybody to get out of such circumstances. So this was a really rough mission. They get back to Halesworth, and their commanding officer has a surprise for them. He said, fellas, we have a live musical concert here for you. Glenn Miller and his band are here to perform some hits for you. And this is a photograph from that very day in the very hangar. So John is in this sea of humanity here within the photograph, and we can see Glenn Miller playing his trombone right there on the makeshift stage. For John, this is one of the most surreal moments of his war, because he said 3 hours earlier, I was seeing my friends die in combat, and now here I am tapping my toes to Chattanooga Choo Choo. And it speaks to the sort of emotional roller coaster that airmen found themselves in. They could go blow off steam in London. They had hot meals and fresh bed sheets. They had a degree of comfort in their lives, but they had to balance that with the horrors in the combat zone that they saw day in and day out. So that's a stark memory in John's mind. Something that alleviates a little bit of that pressure, something that happened 80 years ago, just about last week. And that's a little-known incident in the war known as Operation Trucking. And this is where the 8th Air Force was delivering supplies to starving French civilians in the vicinity of Orloff. And to John, this felt very rewarding because he felt, now I'm saving lives rather than taking them. I'm delivering supplies rather than dropping bombs. But while he was here in Orloff, a French civilian goes up to him and gives him this souvenir, which John still has on his office desk today, and that is a wooden German bullet that was found somewhere on the front, and John still has that still. Let me grab a sip of water here real quick. The very next mission, which happened 80 years ago, just a few days ago, was John's most perilous mission of all. And that was to drop supplies to beleaguered paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne the day after Operation Market Garden commences in Holland. This mission was very atypical for John, because rather than flying at 24,000 feet, he's flying at 500 feet. And he's dropping parachutes rather than bombs. And this was, in his words, a Murphy's Law mission. Everything that seemingly could go wrong did go wrong. He drops the supplies to the paratroopers, drops them right on target, but by this point, 2 engines have gone out. The tail is shot out. The hydraulic lines are severed. The interior of the plane starts to fill up with fog. He's mostly blinded by that fog. He can't even see his pilot, who's sitting 2 feet away from him. The plane is shot to bits. There's no sound or logical reason as to how or why he could have survived this mission. But somehow, they're able to get this plane back across the North Sea to emergency airstrip in England. And that's where they hang on for the hairiest landing of their lives. And John recalls of this moment. We skidded uncontrollably off the airstrip. I don't think I ever held the controls tighter. I gritted my teeth. There was a feeling of helplessness in our efforts to halt the aircraft. The sensation was like being hurled from a massive slingshot with little power to control direction. The experience was utterly terrifying. Yet somehow, they survived this mission, even though their plane did not. And that was the end of his B-24 that was named Joe, J-O. And with that, they get a new B-24, which is called Rebel Gal, which has a scantily clad blonde painted on the nose, which was quite customary to Allied aircraft. But for that very same mission, John receives the Distinguished Flying Cross. So it was truly an act of valor that allowed him to get his crewmates home. And not long after that very desperate mission, his crew is sent to what is known as a flak home, or a flak shack, where they could get a little bit of rest and recreation. And while John's crew did just that, they would swim and play tennis, John had another mission in mind. Because his parents were actually immigrants from England. He had family living in the United Kingdom, family that he had never met. And so while he had this little bit of leave in Southport, he determined that he was going to take a 2-hour train ride to the community of Hull. That's exactly what he did. He was given an address in case this eventuality might arise. He wandered through the city. He found the address. He knocked on the door. The door opened up, and inside was his grandmother, who he had never seen in person. And she immediately started to cry, and she said, "You look exactly like your father when he left." She knew immediately who he was without a word having been said. And the two of them embraced there on the stoop of his grandparents' home. You can't make this stuff up. And he said, considering all of the emotional turmoil that I had gone through over the last 2 weeks, there was nothing that could have made me feel better than being hugged by my grandmother for the very first time, as a world war was underway, no less. And over the next 2 nights, his grandmother, grandfather, and aunt went pubbing. They went bar hopping. And at the end of those 3 days, he went back to the flak shack, and that was the only time that he ever met his English grandparents. It was here in October of 1944, and a very memorable and sentimental memory it was. As John nears mission number 35, which will ultimately allow him to go home, two of these missions were over Cologne, Germany, which a few months later were more indiscriminately targeted by the Army Air Forces. And by the end of the war, this is what Cologne looks like. When John was flying missions, the Air Forces was still primarily targeting industrial and military bases and complexes and things like that. Starting in December, January, February 1945, however, the Americans started to embrace the British strategy of indiscriminate bombing, being less picky in their targets, and this is the end result of a lot of that. And I think it leads to this important conversation on the moral gray areas of waging a world war, because it leads to this important question of how much do you need to embrace evil in order to defeat evil? Do you need to become a little bit like your enemy in the name of the greater good? And what do you sacrifice in turn when you're compelled to do that? These are tough questions that I don't have the answers for, but the stories of the dead and the war compel us to at least think about it. And certainly places like Cologne beg us to do so. John's final mission comes 2 days before Armistice Day in 1944. This is a mission that was ordered directly by General Patton himself to lessen up the tactical congestion around Metz, France. And this is the installation that John will bomb on that final mission, Fort Driant, which was actually part of the old Maginot Line left over from the First World War. And after he drops his bombs, he becomes ecstatic because he realizes that he is going home. What do you think he does when he gets back to base? He starts drinking. Absolutely. He goes into the officers' club, he goes up to the bar, slams his hand on the counter, and he yells out, "Scotch." And he said, "I drank until I could drink no more." He literally went blind that night. And his final mission thereafter was not to fly anywhere, but to navigate his way from the officers' club back to his barracks safely. And during that perilous journey up the wooded pathway, he walked into a tree, and he fell down. And he had thought that somebody punched him. And he stood up, he shakes off his trousers, and he says, "You SOB." And he punches the tree back. And he lost this battle. And he said, I was more greatly injured in that battle with that tree than what I was during any combat mission that I flew during the Second World War. So serves a very important lesson. Don't get drunk and then pick a fight with a tree. By mid-December of 1944, John is homebound. Enters in a convoy going across the North Atlantic, and that convoy arrives in New York City on December 23rd, 1944, 2 days before Christmas. And he said that it was a foggy day, but the water was mirror smooth, and just as they were going past the Statue of Liberty, the fog lifted, and everybody was up on deck, and they saw Lady Liberty, and he said everybody was completely quiet. And he said, I had seen the Statue of Liberty more times than I could count. But now, having gone through what he had gone through, he had a whole new appreciation for the Statue of Liberty and what it represented. And he was relieved that New York City was not a pile of ruin like most cities in Europe were that he had seen. John continues his service throughout the duration of the war. He goes on to Texas and Florida, fully anticipating that he'll be deployed to the Pacific, but the atomic bombs render that unnecessary. Before the war's over, he wins the modern equivalent of $50,000 at poker, and he buys a brand new 1942 DeSoto. A 1942 car was as new a car as you could get in the United States in 1945 because of rationing and whatnot. And that car served him well over the next 9 years, as he went to Rutgers University on the GI Bill. He married Irene in 1946, and he started a family. He eventually gained employment with Johnson & Johnson and spent the next 35 years of his career working in various sectors of industrial manufacturing. And it wasn't until the 1980s that he finally had the opportunity to reconnect with many of his crewmates. And at one of those reunions, they pledged together that the last man standing amongst them would open up a bottle of champagne and raise a toast to all of those who were no longer with them. And that unfortunate honor befell John in 2013 when the last of his fellow crewmates passed away. And so John has been the last of these 10 men for well over 11 years now. And there's hardly a day goes by where he doesn't think about them. John turned 100 years old in January. The 489th Bomb Group, which is still active today, sent him their unit guidon, their unit flag, as a birthday present. And John is appropriately wearing a pin that says, "I've survived damn near everything." That's very true, including a bout of COVID as well. And in our book, I think he says many poignant things. Chief among them is this, though. And it's a plea for us, it's a plea for the future. He says, bombs are not the answer. Choose democracy. Vote to save the principles that I and millions of others risked our lives to maintain. Hold leaders accountable via the ballot box and our First Amendment rights. Remember that the Pledge of Allegiance is to the Republic and not to a single individual yearning for power. If I were 70 years younger, I'd gladly sign up to fend off the forces of anti-democracy again. But others who are younger will have to resist in a different way this time. All I can do now is offer the lessons from my own life and hope readers take them to heart. And I think these are very wise words from a life exceedingly and luckily well lived. Thank you for coming out to my presentation today.
Jared, if anyone has any questions for Dr. Frederick, I think I got hand up first, and we'll get back up here to the front. I'll hand you the microphone if you'd like to.
Thank you. Great talk.
Thank you.
Was the reason John was allowed to go home, did he complete the 25 missions? And could you just explain how hard that was for a pilot to actually get to 25 missions?
Excellent. So by this point in the war, when John entered the European theater, the mission quota had been raised to 30. And then when he was partway through his missions, it was raised to 35 missions. So this led to great agitation on the part of airmen because they felt like they were trapped in this losing game in which the deck was stacked against them. Amazingly, every man aboard John's plane survives the war. Some of them were injured or wounded on these missions, but that's something that John takes great pride in, that collectively they flew 35 missions and everybody came home. And that in and of itself was a rarity. But John gets into that a little bit, and he says that General Eisenhower and people at SHAEF recognized the fact that they couldn't afford to send experienced airmen home after 25 missions. They needed them longer, especially if the campaign in Europe were to otherwise fall flat on its rear end. John used different language, but I'll tame it down here for us. So yeah, that's how it worked. There was a lot of frustration felt among air bases.
Thank you for your talk and the information for all of us.
Sure.
I was just wondering when, the last slide, when he was speaking about democracy, when that occurred, when he gave that talk.
He said that to me the fall of 2021. Yeah. There we go.
There's a recent book called The Bomber Mafia where they discuss the philosophy of American precision bombing versus the British just carpet bombing at night. And this author makes the case that precision bombing was really a myth. The Norden bomb site couldn't drop a bomb in a pickle barrel. They would drop thousands of bombs on a munitions plant or ball bearing factory and only hit the building in question with single-digit bombs out of thousands dropped.
Correct.
So, can you speak to the issue of how that led to this decision of a change of philosophy?
Yes. So those are excellent points raised, and I think it speaks to a lot of the nuance of the air war as well. Because even though bombs would sometimes fall hundreds of yards, even if not miles off target in time, the intent, I think, is key in these sorts of situations. Because at least to the press and at least to their men, Allied air commanders for the United States were making the argument that we are not purposefully bombing civilians. Of course, there will be collateral damage. And I think a lot of this tied into the propaganda purposes of the Allied war effort, that we're trying to stay above or stay ahead or be more moralistically inclined than our enemy is. But by 1945, there's no love loss. And especially after Allied ground troops enter Germany, they see that these people are die-hard. And there's no such thing as a German that's not a Nazi. At least that's how Allied ground troops saw it. And so increasingly, Americans started to see Germans the same as Japanese. This is an enemy race. We need to annihilate them. And we really don't care if we kill civilians at this point. So it's a temperament and a philosophy and a strategy that evolves over time, and it evolves due to the ground conditions on the ground level. I hope that suitably answers your question.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Maybe two questions. The first one is, did he have air support, fighter air support on all of his missions?
Yes, he loved P-51s. He still does. He likes P-47s too. He referred to these as little friends. On inter-aircraft chatter, they would refer to each other as big brother and little brother. And he said P-47 saved our hide more than once. And he writes about that in a number of occasions throughout the book. So yes, there was air support, and it became greater and more numerous as the war progressed.
And my second one is, my daughter's always feeding me World War II books that she's read. So, you talked about evil becoming more evil than the evil you're trying to conquer, and that seems like maybe that was the mindset of Spears in your previous book.
Yes. So one of my previous books is a biography on Ronald Spears, who's one of the key protagonists in Band of Brothers. And for somebody like Spears, where he famously has this fatalistic attitude that you just need to accept the fact that you're already dead. We see that a lot in airman culture as well. It was really the only way to function, was to accept the fact that there's a strong probability that you aren't coming back. And so I think that sort of gallows attitude was pervasive among people who were constantly in combat. And if anybody would like to talk on a more one-on-one basis or chat afterward, I'm happy to stick around here after the tent. And the next speaker is in a mere half hour where you can learn more about the air war. So thank you for coming out.
Good afternoon, everyone. How's everybody doing? Good. Are we enjoying World War II weekend this year? Yes. I'm glad our rain was overnight and not today. So, well, thank you all for coming. Thank you all for being here. My name is Dan Vermelia. I have the honor of working here at Eisenhower National Historic Site as a park ranger. We have a tremendous staff and team here with the National Park Service that has made this weekend possible. There are, by my last count, 20 different agencies, organizations, partner groups, museums participating in this, and that's not counting our living history groups. So this is a community effort, it's a team effort, and I think that in and of itself a tribute to Ike and the Allied effort 80 years ago in 1944. We've had, yeah, absolutely. We've had a tremendous weekend here, lots of great programming. The camp is still open until 3 o'clock, so after our program here, if you would like to join our last Ranger Guided Camp Walk at 2, feel free to go and do that. We still have some great programming going on, but we're honored to have our final speaker's presentation of the weekend. We began Friday evening with our friend Henry Sledge, who is somewhere around here. Hey, Henry. Talking about his father, Eugene Sledge, and his service in the Pacific Theater of the Second World War. And we're wrapping up our weekend with our friend, Mr. John Orloff, who's joining us here to talk about his work. Yeah, absolutely. His work translating the stories of the Second World War. And this is perfectly timed, by the way. Consider this part of your applause,
My
right?
car is here. I've got to go.
Yeah.
My ride.
Consider that part of your applause. It's a tribute. They're big fans of the show.
Ah, good.
Big fans of the show. Well, John, I want to give you a formal introduction here. John is an acclaimed American screenwriter known for creating and adapting complex stories and widely disparate genres. He was nominated for an Emmy Award for his writing in HBO's Band of Brothers, as well as an Independent Spirit Award for his screenplay A Mighty Heart, the Michael Winterbottom film based on the kidnapping and death of reporter Daniel Pearl. He spent much of the last decade researching, creating, writing, and producing Masters of the Air, which debuted earlier this year on Apple TV+, an epic 9-part miniseries executive produced by Tom Hanks and Steven Spielberg, chronicling the 100th Bomb Group's honesty in the European theater of World War II. The show stars Oscar nominees Austin Butler, Barry Keoghan, and Callum Turner. John is fourth-generation Hollywood, grew up in Los Angeles, but now he lives by a river in the Berkshire Mountains with bears and everything, right,
Yep,
John?
Yeah, definitely with bears.
Yeah.
My car was destroyed by a bear about
Yeah.
4 months ago. I mean, destroyed.
Well, thank you for joining us. We're thrilled to have you here. Thanks
You
for
bet.
being here.
I am thrilled to be here.
Well, let's start off our conversation. We're going to have a chance to get some broader questions here, but let's start off our conversation by fourth-generation Hollywood screenwriter. Why World War II? What draws you to this subject matter in your work?
Well, I grew up obsessed with World War II in the 70s. I loved World War II movies, Guns of Navarone. I mean, you could just go on Patton. I kind of grew up on that entertainment. And I was also sort of a latchkey kid. My parents were divorced. And when I was a kid, me and my friends would play Army, and we would get World War II Army surplus stuff. And, then I'd watch World War II TV shows, because that's what you did in the 70s. So I really grew up with World War II sort of ingrained in me, even though I have no relatives that I know of that served during the war. My father's Korean generation, the Korea conflict. So I was just obsessed with it, and always have been, quite frankly.
Yeah. So this show that took 10 years to produce and create, can you tell us a little bit about the origins of this series and maybe the start of that process?
Sure. Yeah. So I was a little World War II'd out after Band of Brothers. These are really intense projects, very emotional, and it's one of the reasons why I didn't partake in the Pacific. I was just needing a time out from all of that, because there's an enormous responsibility when you do one of these shows. It's not just like any other show. I mean, it ended up consuming 10 years of my life, Masters of the Air.
Yeah.
And I mean really consuming my life. So I sort of stepped away from World War II, and then around 2013, I think, Tom Hanks called me up and asked me if I wanted to do another one about the air war. And again, I was like a little hesitant, but I read the book, and at that point, Tom had sort of said he only wanted me to write an episode or two, so I was all in for that.
Yeah.
And slowly it just turned into 10 years of my life.
Yeah. So it goes from one episode to
10. Even though we ended up doing 9 episodes,
right.
But we wrote 10.
And you told me in our first conversation a while back, I think back when the show was airing, we talked for the first time. You said this was the hardest thing that any of you had ever done. And obviously, because of the nature of what this is, you have to get it right. But tell us a little bit more about what some of those challenges were that made it such a hard process.
Well, the scale of it. From day one, when one of the reasons I wanted to do the project, I can't speak for other people, was the air war has never really been shown incredibly accurately in film. I mean, it's been, 12 O'Clock High is a great film, The War Lover is a great film, Memphis Belle is a great film, but technically you couldn't show what it was really like up there in those films. You didn't, 12 O'Clock High is, the combat sequences have real footage, right? And it's real footage is actually not great to tell stories, and it actually, we get into really complicated camera stuff, but that's not really what a battle looked like, how it is in 12 O'Clock High. It's much more accurate in Masters. But so that was the first thing. Like when we had made Band and when they had continued with Pacific, we'd seen good films, about infantry and the Marines, and so while both Band and the Pacific were incredibly new and deeply thought out and all of those things, it was still something that audiences were pretty familiar with. Masters was all about scale and scope. In some ways the opposite of Band or the Pacific, which are very tightly focused, Masters is not tightly focused, and the image that was always driving me was 1,000 airplanes in the air.
Yeah.
Right? That was the thing that was like, okay, nobody's seen that since 1945.
Yeah.
Nobody's even tried to do it in a movie. And so that then, so making a show about 1,000 airplanes in the air is very fucking complicated. It's very complicated, especially if no B-17s really fly anymore. Yeah, there's a few, but they're not going to let us fly them. And so technically, it was just a horse of a different color from Band or the Pacific. We had as many special effects shots in Masters of the Air. We had more special effects shots in Masters of the Air than they did in the Avatar movie.
Oh,
wow. Basically, so that makes things infinitely more complicated.
Yeah.
Air made it, everything was more complicated.
I think I'd seen an interview you did around when the show debuted, and you mentioned that these are things people haven't seen in combat since 1944 and 45, and in those early episodes you're seeing views of planes flying by and at the speed. It's stunning, the visuals of this. Let's talk about the focus of the show for a minute. Band of Brothers follows Easy Company, 101st Airborne. The Pacific follows 3 stories through the Pacific Theater of Marines. I know Don Miller's book is the title of source of the title of the series, but why the 100th Bomb Group? How did that stand out?
So the story is Steven Spielberg read Masters of the Air and called up Tom Hanks and said, this should be the next one. I think we should do a show about Buck and Bucky, these 2 guys, who are Egan and Clevin in the show. And it's around 40 or 50 pages of the book, Masters of the Air, is about the 100th Bomber Group. It's an overview, I don't know how many have read it, but it's an overview of the 8th Army Air Force's battle against Germany. But the whole 8th Army Air Force, not one little group. So it talks about a whole... Eisenhower is mentioned more in the book than Clevin or Egan. The book is not about Clevin or Egan. So my first task was to try to figure out how to make a show around Clevin and Egan. And there's no biographies of them, there's no books about them, there's no anything other than this Masters of the Air. And so that required about a year of research, figuring out what these 2 guys did in the course of their tour of duty. And in that process, I mean, obviously, Robert Rosenthal and Crosby are mentioned in the book, Rosenthal more. But Crosby became really important from a narrative standpoint when I realized, so here's the narrative problem, the difficulty with Masters of the Air. Our 2 main characters are shot down, no, spoiler alert, shot down, and then they go into the POW camp. And now nobody knows them that's left at the 100th Bomber Group. They've all been shot down. When Clevin and Egan go down, that's 34 of the original 36 B-17s are down in 12 weeks. So now I have a whole new cast of characters at Thorpe Abbott's that don't know Buck and Bucky. So Crosby is the only guy who arrived in May of 43, flew a B-17, and was still there on VE Day. So that suddenly he became a main character because he was the through line between the two eras of the first era, the early guys, Buck and Bucky, and then the second era of the 100th is sort of dominated by Robert Rosenthal because he really was sort of a la Dick Winters, a really unique individual, a really special human being. And so Rosie's story was just as important, but it would come out of left field because Rosie arrives, I think, 3 weeks before Egan goes down. So they're not friends. They don't have a relationship, you know. So once I figured out those were my four main characters, then I was kind of off to the races.
Well, and Crosby, who is a navigator, serves almost as this navigating voice in the series, right?
Right.
Another, I guess there's going to be a lot of spoilers today, but yeah, he's narrating certain things for us and guiding us through. How much did his memoir, Wing and a Prayer, help you as well?
Hugely.
Yeah.
That was a key thing that I read, and I was like, oh, okay, now I understand how I can make this work. Yeah, his book is really good, by the way. He's a really good writer. He had gone, one of the interesting things about the 8th Army Air Force, as opposed to Band of Brothers and the Airborne, is the officers, the flight officers, tended to be college educated by necessity because there was so much math involved in flying an airplane. And as a result, they tended to be more intelligent and better spoken. And so Crosby, in fact, I think after the war he got his, no, I think he was trying to get his master's in, right? Wasn't he trying? I can't remember whether he got his master's in creative writing before or after the war. Probably after the war. But he was a writer.
Yeah.
He was a professional writer.
Yeah.
And he was a great writer, and it's a great book, and it really was helpful.
Well, I'm curious, with your work on Band of Brothers, you were working on that with veterans still alive.
Very different process.
You got to know some of those veterans quite well, right?
Yes, yeah.
Including Dick Winters.
Yeah.
So let's talk about that. This is now much later on. How does that change the process with the veterans not being there?
Everything. It changed everything. When we had, you could call up Dick Winters and say, okay, well, what did you feel when this happened? Or tell me more about this thing. And he would tell you. I obviously, pretty much all of our main characters have passed in the 100th Bomber Group. I could talk to a couple of pilots and crew members, but they weren't like the guys I was writing about. And that's very different because everybody has their own experiences. But it was harder. I mean, it was a lot harder to not be able to have those guys at hand.
Did you find of those four main characters, Clevin, Egan, Rosenthal, and Crosby, did you find one that you were most drawn to or maybe felt that you related to the most?
I was really attracted to Egan. I don't know why. And Egan, I sort of felt was the most like me, and he's probably more in the show than he would be because I love him a lot.
Okay, that's fair. That's fair.
Yeah, that was the character I sort of really. I mean, Rosie, to me, Rosenthal is sort of like Dick Winters. They're almost unapproachable. They're so heroic. Mm-hmm. They're so I can't compare myself to them. They're just on a different plane.
Yeah. Well, along those lines, I'm curious if there's a scene in the show. We'll talk more about some of the historic aspects of the air war here in a moment. But was there a scene in the show that you think that in the final version that aired came out just exactly the way you envisioned it, or is it as close to? Is there one scene in particular that you think is exactly how you want it?
Yeah, I mean, listen, being a writer is a very difficult thing because I'm not the boss, right? Like, I have a lot of say in what happens, what you see on screen, but I'm not the total boss, right? So, and we had hired these really talented directors who were film directors, and they had their own ideas about how they would want to do things, and so we had to incorporate their ideas. You know, it's a collaborative medium, so not everything is how I want it, but that's normal. I think my favorite battle in the show is episode 5, the Munster battle, where Rosie, where they can only get 13 planes up and 12 are shot down, and Rosie is the only guy to come back. And imagine, this is his 3rd mission in 3 days. So mission 1 is the mission that Cleven goes down on in Bremen on October 8th, I think. And they had, I think, like 27 planes and 10 get shot down. Those aren't exact numbers. And then the next mission is a Sunday, I think, the 9th. It's a milk run for Rosie, so everybody comes home. And then his 3rd day is Munster. So the first day they've lost like 10 planes. The 3rd day they lose 12 out of 13 planes. That's his first 3 days.
Yeah.
Now each one of those planes has 10 guys on it. So in his first 3 days, more than 200 guys have gone down. You know? And he's the only plane to come back. And it all happened like we showed it. Everything. Even him outwitting the people. So the tech guy. So we hired all these technicians, right? Like everybody, every expert that ever lived about a B-17. And we had this one guy, nice guy. He flew B-17s as a reenactor in California. And he read the script for 5, and he's like, you can't do that in a B-17. That never happened. You can't shoot that. I was like, what are you talking about? And we got into a very serious argument. I mean, like, almost getting really physical. I was like, and I finally just said, maybe you can't do that in a B-17. But Rosie did. Yeah. And here you can look at the after report.
And that's him flying it like a fighter pilot.
Correct.
Maneuvering around to get
Correct, and he did that. At least he says he did it, and I'm not going to call him a liar.
Yeah.
You know, he did those maneuvers. And the reason was, this is the thing, he wasn't just some guy who showed up and started to fly an airplane. He had spent most of 1942-43 as a pilot of a B-17 in Texas, where he would take gunners up, and it would be gunnery training. So he'd be in Texas, they'd be flying like a target behind them, and gunning crews would practice target. But what that meant was he had flown a B-17 for like 9 months, 8 hours a day, 10 hours a day, before he ever got to England. And so when he got there, he just knew how to fly a plane. Yeah. He knew how to fly a B-17.
Well, and I think one of the beautiful things about shows like this is it takes these real people who are heroic in many ways, and it makes them relatable to us, and it reminds us of their humanity. So we're talking a lot about Rosie, so let's focus on him here for a moment.
Yeah.
He ends up flying, 52 missions?
52 missions,
And then after the war...
He's shot down 3 times.
Shot down 3 times. And after the war, he is a prosecutor with the Nuremberg trials.
Right.
That's a record of service that is hard for so many of us to relate to, but he's a human, and and one of the humanizing elements for him is the way that music is included with him. Mm-hmm. Is that something that he really was?
Yep.
Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Really into jazz and big band, way into dancing. He was, he really loved music. He was an athlete. He was a star athlete. He became a lawyer before the war, like just weeks before Pearl Harbor. He had graduated that, I guess, spring, law school. He was a really amazing individual. And the thing about the Nuremberg thing that I always find really interesting is, and there's a line in the show that sort of hints at it, the job wasn't done. He wasn't going to go home till the job was done. And the Nuremberg trials was the final part of getting the job done.
Absolutely. Well, let's talk a little bit more about translating such complex stories to a television show with dramatic narratives and all that. When you're doing research on something like this, there's Don Miller's book, there's Harry Crosby's memoir. What are other sources you found that were so useful, like missing aircrew reports?
Oh
all
yeah,
that kind
absolutely,
of stuff.
all that stuff. Well, one of the thing that's great about the Air Force was they took notes on everything. So if you see it in the show, this is how it would go. After a mission, the first thing they would do is go to the interrogation hut, where they would give an after-mission debriefing, so they could tell everybody what went wrong. Right? Why are we suffering so many losses? Why are so many planes going down? What can we do to fix it on the next mission? Well, we can only do that by figuring out what went wrong on the last mission. So all that paperwork still exists. So I could go into a mission, see who was on every plane, what the formation was, what happened during the mission. You know, one of the things that I decided very early on was, in those battles, every plane you see is a real, I mean, it's a special effect, but it's a real plane in history. We didn't just put, you know, Austin Butler, sexy guy in a, pilot cap and put him in a plane and then just put other planes next to him. No, every single plane, we know who's in those planes in the battles. Every single battle. Every plane you see go down, it's probably going down historically accurately, even though you don't even know who's on it. We do. And so if a plane goes down in the after-mission report because engine number 1 and 3 went off and that's what made it go down, that's what happens in the show. Even planes that you barely know.
Yeah.
But we could only do that because the after-mission reports existed. You know, with On Band of Brothers, they didn't have after-mission reports like that. So it was just asking Dick, Winters, or Garnier what happened.
Yeah.
Here I didn't have to do that.
Well, and the show also captures what life was like between missions, I think, quite well for these airmen. Did you visit Thorpe Abbott's?
Yeah, I did visit Thorpe Abbott's in East Anglia. And that was obviously another really interesting difference between Band of Brothers, the Pacific, versus Masters, which is, you know, in the Pacific and Band, those guys were in theater for, you know, weeks and weeks and weeks, leading very difficult lives. The weird thing about being an airman was you would get in your airplane, you'd go on a 6 or 8 hour terrifying mission, and then you'd come home and, you know, you could go to the bar, you could get a drink, you could go find a girl, you could have a nice, 3 days before you had to fly again. So they had this sort of like rubber banding of terror, terror, terror. Oh, now we're going to go to the pub. Terror, terror, terror. Very different than being in field.
Well, and I think it's in Don Miller's book, and I've read it elsewhere, that had a unique kind of psychological toll on them as compared to if you're in frontline combat day after day after day, you're not going out of that and into some comfortable environment. It's the jarring juxtaposition of the two.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. And then you add on top of that, by mid-1943, so what, just timeline, obviously Pearl Harbor, 1941, 1942, we're building, we start the war with less than 200 B-17s. We have less than 200, the entire Air Force, Army, it wasn't even the Air Force then, the Army Air Corps, less than 200 B-17s. By the end of the war, we build 13,000, I think, 13,000 B-17s, 12,000 and change, and then another like 14,000 B-26. I mean, the numbers are staggering. And then in 42, so 41 we have 200 B-17s, 42 we start sending small air crews over to England, and they're just getting their butts kicked. And then in 43, they're still getting their butts kicked. And the 100th arrives in May of 43. That's when the show starts. And at that point in the war, the life expectancy was 7 missions. And they knew it. So you know it. So you wake up on your 6th mission, then you wake up, 3 days later on your 7th mission. You go up, you come back, and you're now on borrowed time. And you've got, how many more? 18 more?
Yeah.
18 more missions you have to fly on borrowed time. And they all knew that.
Yeah.
They knew they were probably going to die.
Which I think leads to, is at the heart of the show, is why do they keep getting back in the plane, right? Like, what do you think? I mean, it's an individual answer for everybody,
It
right?
is. I can't answer it,
Yeah,
because it is kind of unimaginable.
Yeah, and it's I think one of the things about it is it's each other, it's their belief in what they're fighting for. Everybody has their own, whether it's friendship or whatnot, with Egan coming back and wanting to get back in the plane because they just shot his buddy down.
All true.
Everybody has, and I think that's a very real part of it from the lived experiences of these veterans.
Yeah, and I mean, I think any sort of band of brothers, anybody in combat, there is that foxhole sort of relationship that is sacred and is the reason you get up and fight. It's not for your country necessarily, but for the guy in the foxhole with you.
Yeah. Well, as our event is talking about 1944 this year, I guess we should probably at least mention this event that happened early June 1944, probably around the 6th, D-Day, right?
Yeah, I know a little about that one too.
The Day of Days.
Day of Days,
so
I called it.
You've depicted it in 2 series with Band of Brothers and Masters of the Air.
I wanted the Masters of the Air one to be different. That was not my first choice, but that's okay. Like I said, it happens.
Well, I mean, let's talk maybe about the Band of Brothers episode with that. What was that process like of taking something so famous and so legendary as D-Day and
D-Day, but not Break or Man. Nobody knew.
But you're finding the way to include this story into it. Yeah.
Well, it was interesting because it was 1998, I think, when I got the job, and it's way before the internet exists, really. And Saving Private Ryan, I think, was only like 2 years earlier. And I don't know, some of you are old enough to remember, before Saving Private Ryan, like World War II movies were just in a different category. And then Saving Private Ryan, they were kind of like has-been, people didn't make them anymore. And then Spielberg makes Saving Private Ryan, and the D-Day, 20 minutes of the opening D-Day changed cinema history and changed our relationship to the war in a lot of ways. And so my task was, to try to figure out how to show D-Day in an exciting way that has nothing to do with Tom Hanks and, Higgins boats. Luckily, obviously, Dick Winters had one of the most phenomenal 24 hours that an American soldier has ever had. Among them, Sledge as well. Obviously, he has his stories too, but it's that kind of level of, oh my gosh. I mean, I always just sort of say, listen, the guy drops into Nazi-occupied France in the middle of the night, armed with nothing but a buck knife, and by the end of the day, he's captured and destroyed 4 German cannons shooting on Utah Beach.
Yeah.
I mean, it's bonkers.
Dick Winters, who actually was part of one of our World War II weekends years and years ago, back in the 90s. So it's nice to be talking about him here today.
Yeah.
Well, let's shift back to Masters for a moment here. A big part of the show takes place at a POW camp, Stalag Luft 3. Tell us a little bit about the challenges of writing those storylines.
Well, the Stalag was a challenge. I went way deep in the research. I didn't really answer your research question because I did just crazy research. It was really intense. 30, 40 books, and because again, suddenly now I have to know everything about the Stalag. And it's actually true. I mean, this is one of the reasons why we chose the story. That what happens with Buck and Bucky really happened. Buck was shot down. Bucky did want to avenge it, comes back from London, gets shot down 2 days later, and they end up not just in the same POW camp, they end up in the same barracks. You know, you can't make that up as a writer. You probably wouldn't believe it if I did. But they did. They ended up in the same barracks. I actually discovered in my own research that Clevin was part of, they call it the chicken coop, but he was part of the radio underground that's also true in the show, that Buck was getting the BBC on a handmade radio in the Stalag. But I actually discovered that. Nobody knew he had been doing that until I figured that out. Yeah, it's just a whole nother layer of world that I had to learn, and then play with the fact that that's where the Great Escape happened.
Yeah.
But it did not happen with our guys because they were in the American compound, not the British compound. So I thought it would be interesting to sort of show the escape from the perspective of the guys who don't go on it, basically.
Well, and that also, I mean, so many things about the show, whether it's, you know, all these details of daily life in the camp or life on base, all these various connections and stories. One of those stories that is brought in later in the series is these connections they have with Tuskegee Airmen in the camp. Why was that so important to include?
Well, it was really interesting to me that, so in August of '44, the Tuskegee guys start to get shot down, and they end up at Stalag Luft 3. And, you know, they've lived in a country, I mean, I don't have to tell you. And so what does that feel like when these black heroes show up at this Stalag filled with only white people in a society that, you know, is not ready for that? And I thought that would be really, really interesting to explore. Plus it gave us a chance in these trilogies to, you know, share as much as we could of the African-American experience in the war. It's hard to do because, you know, these groups were segregated, you know.
Absolutely, yeah. It's essential for broadening out this story here.
Yeah, I mean, it's been a you know, obviously in all of the shows we would have. It's just hard to do, you know, in an organic way, and this led us down a somewhat organic path to share that experience too.
Well, on the broader sense, you know, this show depicting this unique thing in the history of warfare with these technologies, with the Norden bomb sight and all this developed during the Second World War, and within, you know, 10, 15 years, or not even that long afterwards, we're moving into different eras of aerial warfare and things. The depictions of fighting in the frigid cold, the high casualty rates, all of this. You know, when you look at it from a broader sense, having spent 10 years of your life working on this, was the strategic bombing campaign, was what these guys did. How do you assess all of that?
I have totally abstained from that conversation because I don't know.
Yeah.
You know, and I don't think it's up to me to say whether I think it worked or whether, you know, I don't have any issues with it. You know, I know there are people who feel that the Americans were immoral by bombing, but it's really, there's a lot of interesting stories about it. So in 1943, we would only target military bases outside of a city, period. The Brits were already indiscriminately bombing anywhere in the city. And obviously the Germans had been doing that since before the war, right? In the Spanish Civil War, they were the first country to bomb civilians in the Spanish Civil War and in World War II, when they bombed Rotterdam and then London. So the Americans didn't target any cities until actually the Munster mission of October 10th, 1943, which we show in the show. And I don't know if you noticed, some of the guys are like, wait a minute, we don't want to bomb the middle of Munster. That's not what we do. And there was actually a lot of complaints about that very mission that went further up the chain of command, because that mission was the first time the target was in the middle of a village, or a city, sorry, a city. And, you know, then it becomes a much more complicated, I mean, it was a military target. It was a It was a railway, but it was in the middle of town, and there were civilian deaths. I don't know how to respond.
Okay.
I don't have an issue with it.
Okay. Well, I think, and last question I have, and then we're going to give folks a chance to ask some questions as well, is I want to ask a little bit about including the ground crew guys in this.
Yeah.
And what were some of the resources that you used for material for that?
Yeah, so what happened was, I think the story of Lemons in the Wheel Well is in Don's book, I think. It must be. I don't know, maybe it's not. I don't know. But Don mentions Ken Lemons, who was a staff sergeant in charge of 6 airplanes mechanically, and he was 19 years old. And he'd never gone to school. He was a farmer. Like he could be a mechanic because he'd been on a farm like this and had worked on tractors his whole life. Yeah. And so then he became a mechanic, and he wrote a book. That is key to getting your story told. He wrote a book. And Don Miller read that book and mentioned him in his book. And then I got a copy of that book and read Ken's book and then put in a whole bunch of stuff from Ken's book because I thought it would be really, really important. This wasn't just about pilots, you know. It wasn't just about the swashbucklers and, you know, it's about the grunts on the ground. And, you know, they had a really, you know, they were working 24 hours a day. They didn't stay in their huts. They tended to build a tent right on the hard stand that they were working on, and they would live there rather than in their tents or in their actual Nissan hut because they just were needed on call all the time.
Yeah. Well, I think I have a microphone here. If we have folks who have questions, I will get it to you. I'm going to start right here.
Hey, I love the show. The biggest question I had after watching it was why 9 episodes and not 10? Because I wanted so badly to see a 10th episode
You
about...
and me both.
what happened to these guys after the war?
Money.
Okay.
Money.
Easy answer.
It was an incredibly expensive show. Crazy expensive. And we ran out of money. Like, I mean, you know, there was a certain point where we said, oh my God, we are going to have to combine episodes 9 and 10 into one episode because we were running out of money. You know, there is a, you know, I was just mentioning to somebody else earlier, you know, there were things that you just, we had a lot of money, but it wasn't infinite. And you do have to make choices. And like, for example, if you're a real B-17 nut, you will notice that all of our B-17s are the B-17F model. And those were slowly replaced by the G model, which looked slightly different. It had a chin turret mounted under the nose, and it looks a little different than the ones in our show. But we didn't have enough money to change them out and put in chin turrets on 1,000 airplanes. So, you know, we are stuck with financial realities just like anybody else. And so 9 episodes, not 10.
Next question right here.
Hi, this really isn't so much a question as it is a thank you. As you can tell, I'm a reenactor.
Yeah.
Been portraying Army Air Forces since I was 16.
I love your hat.
Thank you.
Crush cap.
Yep. Over the years, I've become friends with many 8th Air Force veterans.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a member of the 100th Bomb Group Foundation.
Oh, wow.
Became close friends with many of the remaining 100th veterans.
Yeah.
And while I was learning...
Clint Culpepper, right? Clint?
Yeah.
Chip, thank you.
But while I was learning to fly and getting my pilot's license, several of the 100th vets who were pilots would send me messages, giving me tips, advice.
That's great.
One of them, John Clark, he was a 100th pilot. He just passed away a month ago. He was he would always send me tips when I was learning to fly. Always fly in the middle of the air was a common thing he would say.
It's good to, that's a good one.
But over years, they would just become heroes of mine. And it was always odd, a 21-year-old kid being friends with 95-year-old men. But thank you for telling and writing their stories and
thank you very
telling
much.
it to the public. I really appreciate it. And I teared up several times while watching the show.
Oh, thanks.
So I just wanted to say thank you.
I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Hi. So on that, I have a question. You kind of mentioned this already, but can you expand on the fact with the World War II generation leaving us, how do you feel that you are the outlet for a majority of Americans to engage with the Second World War and what that means?
That's intense.
Legacy, yeah.
It's intense. It's intense just losing these guys, you know. I get a little emotional. And, making one of these shows is a real obligation, right? There's the onus of it, the responsibility of these things are really huge. And there were many, many days where Masters of the Air was really, really hard and really difficult, and I thought about not doing it. But I couldn't not do it, right? Because of my relationship with Dick Winters and Garnier and Malarkey and the guys from Band, and knowing the importance of knowing them and sharing their story and having this opportunity to do it a second time, even though I didn't know the men personally, just the weight of Dick Winters was always in my head, making Masters of the Air. Always. I always was thinking of Dick. Yeah. So, but thank you. I do feel a tremendous responsibility. Particularly the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. has reached out to let me know that just informal polling, just when schools would come to the Holocaust Museum and the docent would say, well, where have you first heard of the Holocaust? The biggest answer is now Band of Brothers. And think about it. One of the interesting things about Band of Brothers, I'm really proud of episode 9, Why We Fight, of Band, because when you sign up to watch Band of Brothers, you have no idea you're going to learn about the Holocaust. So what ends up happening as an audience member is you are sucker punched into learning about the Holocaust, just like these guys were, right? And like, if you decide to watch Schindler's List, you're going to watch the Holocaust, right? Like you've set yourself up like, okay, I'm going to go watch the Holocaust now. When you watch Band of Brothers, you don't do that, right? And yet you are kind of forced to learn about them, the Holocaust, because you've been watching this whole show. I would say to people similarly about the Tuskegee Airmen in Masters of the Air. So many people don't know about the Tuskegee Airmen, and they might not watch a movie about the Tuskegee Airmen, but they watched Masters of the Air, and now they have a whole new understanding of the war that they might not have known otherwise.
So, Mr. Orloff, I want to start by saying thank you. And I'm really trying not to get emotional. I think, we are reenactors. And this was particularly interesting to me for obvious reasons. For 10 years, we waited for this. And then when I saw the trailer and I saw pilots who looked like pilots who I had interviewed, I was excited. I said, how are they going to tie the 332nd Fighter Group into this story? And the beginning of episode 8 said this: while the 8th Air Force was hitting the Germans from bases in England, the 15th Air Force was striking at them from bases in Italy. There were 2 occasions in that episode I came to my feet. I was watching this thing in the bed, and there were 2 moments I had to stand up for the writing of this episode. I didn't know Lieutenant Richard Macon, but I was at his funeral at Arlington National Cemetery. But I was friends with Lieutenant Alexander Jefferson. And he passed in 2022, and I know he would have been proud to see this episode.
Yeah.
And the treatment that you did. And the last thing I want to say, you know, I was a friend of John Clark as well. And we were Facebook friends, and he would write me, and I would make a post about something, and he would encourage me. And one time he corrected me. I think I said ball turret was hydraulic, and he said it was electronic, or it was either the other way around.
Right, yeah.
But he did it in such a way, it wasn't berating. It's like, son, just research it. You'll see it for yourself. And he kept pushing me. He says, now on to major, on to major. And I was fine as a captain. And I talked to our commander of our reenactment group. I said, there's this World War II veteran. He said he flew. He's encouraging me to be, you know. And he says, oh, we can make that happen. And I just knew he was a World War II veteran.
Yeah.
But after this, there was a documentary. One of the talking heads was John Clark. I'm like, this guy in the 100 is the person who championed for my promotion.
That's great.
And I tell you that our next meeting, man, I was tearing over. I'm like, look, this guy, you know, thank you so much for writing this story, being true to the story, and being so accurate in everything you did. We all appreciate what you did. Thank you.
I'd like to just sort of add two things to that. One, Jefferson has, and I think we use it at the end of the show, his like headshot. He is like the sexiest looking pilot with his aviator glasses, and it's like the one time where the actor isn't as good looking as the real dude. That was, I can't remember what the other thing was, so go on. Oh, this was it. So you know, listen, everybody gets things wrong in these kind of epic giant shows, and we tried very hard not to get things wrong, but I do want to sort of talk about like how far we would go to get things right. So, as you probably noticed in that opening scene with the Tuskegees, they're flying P-40s accurately. Now that meant there's only one scene in all the 9 hours where there's a P-40. Only this one sequence. But that meant we had to create the P-40s in computers. We had to find a real one if we wanted to be next to one. We didn't have to do that. We could have just thrown them in P-51s, because that's what they're famous for. But we didn't, you know? And that's the kind of, you know, quest for detail that these shows allow us to do.
Got another one here?
Thank you for making such an awesome series.
Thank you.
I remember when I first heard about it, it was about 1.5 to 2 years before the first episode, and those were a long 2 years.
For me too.
Yeah, so you said earlier that you would have done the D-Day episode a little bit differently. Can you discuss how you would have done it?
Well, so I wrote these scripts many, many times. So when the show was finally over and I was looking at all my files, I have like 500 drafts of different episodes. So you can imagine that means they've changed a lot in various versions. And the early versions of the D-Day episode, there was a whole nother character that existed. Really great guy, Tamarillo, Big Frank. No, that wasn't Big Frank. No, just Frank Tamarillo. Big Frank's a different guy. And Frank Tamarillo was this kind of screw-up pilot. And such a screw-up pilot that they get him off base on this thing that they don't even know they're sending him to, and he comes back, and he's been trained to do the radar. So by 1944, we don't show this in the show because it was just too complicated. So by 1944, we had a very, very crude radar that could look at the surface below. And on D-Day, that's what was used, right? They had navigators, obviously, but they actually had in the lead plane, only the lead plane would have it, the radar. And the lead plane was flown by Rosie on 4 missions on D-Day. And so the first one I had was he's flying, and the guy operating the radar is looking down, and he doesn't see anything, and then all of a sudden he sees thousands of blips, all the ships that are headed towards Normandy. And then the clouds part, and the bombing goes on, and blah, 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 blah. That was the difference. I mean, there's no battle by that point, you know, because the airs were clear.
In both Band of Brothers and the Pacific, I think both were done by HBO. Weren't they?
No. Yeah, Band of Brothers in the Pacific were both HBO. Yeah.
And later they brought out these little tin box sets that you could buy with DVDs.
Yeah.
And I must have watched both of them 20 times, probably
Excellent.
more. Practically have them memorized. I'm just curious, and I think a lot of people in the audience would be curious to know whether this will ever come out in a similar box set.
I honestly don't know. You know, that is Apple is a different company. You know, they do things differently. Everything about them was a different experience for us too. You know, as filmmakers, it's a different place than HBO, and I honestly don't know. You know, they don't share that with us. I tend to think not, because their business model, you know, is streaming. You know, I don't know. It's possible. Who knows?
So we have, I think, time for one more. There was a hand over here earlier. I want to make sure I get to you.
Hello again.
Yes, me again. Any insights you can share about how the making of this Masters of the Air impacted the actors who are portraying these amazing pilots who are expected to die?
I think, you know, anytime you do a show like this, the actors become really, you know, step back a second, you know, most of the movies take like 2 months to shoot, to film, that you're on set. Most TV shows, maybe 4 months. These shows are like 10 months, right? And they're longer, like a normal television show shoots in a week, like one episode, 5 days of shooting, and you're done. These shows, it's 5 or 6 weeks per episode of shooting. So the time that these actors had these people in their creative head is much longer, right? And then on top of it, when you add in the things that they're portraying, I think you'd have to be a really, I don't know, total jerk to not be affected, you know, by these people. I will say this, I don't think the actors in Masters of the Air were quite as connected as the actors in Band of Brothers, because they didn't get to meet them, you know? So Damian Lewis got to know Dick Winters, you know? I mean, Frank John Hughes and Garnier were really close. I mean, really close. So I think that changes things in a way that is not replaceable, right? So, yeah, the actors totally became these guys and totally related to them. I mean, we'll see if they continue to do these kind of shows. I don't know. We'll see.
Well, I want to say thank you for joining us today. This was a tremendous conversation. Enjoyed a lot of the comments and our questions here. I think it was a great way as we come to the end or close to the end of our World War II weekend event here, and we reflect on you know, how we keep these stories going forward, how we remember those who fought 80 years ago, and your work with Band of Brothers and now this certainly go a long way towards keeping the memory of these men alive. So I want to say thank you, and we'll present you with one of our challenge coins for the event, titled The Great Crusade. So thank you for joining us, John, and thank you all of us for attending today. Thank you. The Living History Camp's open for another hour. Our last walking tour is getting started now, so if folks want to join that, go right ahead, and thank you all for visiting.
My name's John Galoff from
Hey,
Mendoza,
John.
from Wings of Freedom.
Nice to meet you.
Have you ever been to the Spots Museum down in Boise?
No, I haven't.
I have some pictures.
Yeah.
You were talking about a B-17 raid. In high def, they picture right in the middle
Wow.
of 100.
Oh, yeah?
I would highly recommend it.
Where is it?
It's in Boyertown.
Come down.
Let me show you. We were there about a month ago, and I was so impressed with this place. It's called the Spats. This
Yeah,
guy
no,
here-
I know who Spats is.
Yeah, but this is his museum. And he's,
Where is it?
It's in Boyertown, Pennsylvania. And this guy was a colonel in the Marines, and he put this up with his own money. And he has a 100-foot screen that puts you right in the middle of the
That's crazy.
That's cool. The other thing I learned there, I didn't know that the Germans, they went ahead, they obeyed the Geneva Convention.
When I was younger,
25% of prisoners.
Yeah. No, they were. Think about why.
Like that.
Yeah.
And